The Ark orbiter has been hanging over humanity like a sentence that never ends. And the question of who put it there, whether it was built by human hands, alien intelligence, or something in between, is the deepest and most unsettling mystery buried inside Ark Raiders lore. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Now, a quick word from me as the person who assembled this video. I've been sitting on this topic for a long time because the lore around the Ark orbiter is genuinely fragmented, and I didn't want to rush a reading that deserved more patience. The choice I made when building this video was to start from the human side of the story rather than jumping straight into alien mechanics. There's a pull when you cover something like the Ark orbiter to lead with the spectacle of what it does, but I kept finding that the more I dug, the more interesting thread was always who made the decisions that led to it being in orbit in the first place. I also chose to reorder a few of the lore pieces I found. Some of the in-game documents reference events out of chronological sequence, so I made the call to present them in an order that builds a coherent picture, rather than strictly following the order in which a player might encounter them. What you're going to hear in this video is my interpretation. Where I'm reading between lines, I'll say so. Where the lore seems to point clearly in a direction, I'll point to the evidence. This is not a final answer, but I think it's the most compelling reading the current lore supports. Chapter 1. The World Before Everything Changed. To understand who built the Ark orbiter, you first have to understand the world that existed before it appeared. And that world, the one Ark Raiders quietly sketches through its environmental lore and scattered documents, was not a world that looked much different from our own near future. Humanity had not achieved utopia. It had achieved scale. Cities were larger, corporations were more powerful, and the gap between what technology could do and what it was actually used for had grown into something almost philosophical. This is the backdrop against which every decision about the Ark was made, and it matters more than most lore overviews give it credit for. The game suggests that by the time the Ark descended, humanity had been living through a period of extended technological acceleration that was producing extraordinary capabilities alongside extraordinary instability. Space had become not just a frontier for national programs, but a commercial arena where private entities competed for orbital real estate, satellite contracts, and long-range resource extraction rights. The lore points toward a version of the future where the boundaries between military, corporate, and scientific ambition had blurred almost completely. When you find documents in Ark Raiders referencing orbital infrastructure, it is never just one country's program. It is always a web of competing interests operating in the same shared space. One possible reading of the early lore is that the decades preceding the Ark's arrival were defined by a kind of orbital gold rush. Multiple factions, some of which we will get to later in this video, had significant infrastructure above the atmosphere. Communication satellites, research platforms, weapons platforms, that governments called research platforms, and private stations belonging to corporations that had enough money to build what governments couldn't justify publicly. The sky, in other words, was already crowded, and that crowding is going to matter when we start asking questions about where the Ark orbiter came from, because the answer may not be that it arrived from somewhere else. Some of what we find in the lore suggests it was already there, hiding in plain sight. The political landscape the lore sketches is worth lingering on. There is a strong implication across multiple in-game sources that the governments of the pre-Ark world had become increasingly dependent on private contractors for their most sensitive capabilities. This wasn't unusual for the era the game describes. Defense, surveillance, logistics, and increasingly, space operations were run by companies that answered to shareholders as much as to any national authority. The lore doesn't give us clean names and dates, but it does give us the shape of the thing. You see references to procurement contracts, to classified partnerships, to joint ventures that were publicly described in very different terms than what they actually were. This is a world that had normalized the outsourcing of its most dangerous projects. What makes this setup interesting for our investigation is that it means there is no single origin point to trace. If you are looking for the creator of the Arc Orbiter and you're expecting to find a government program with a name and a budget line, the law consistently pushes back against that expectation. The pieces we have suggest something more distributed, more layered, a project that might have had government seed money but corporate execution, scientific ambition but military application, an official explanation and a real one. This is the kind of world where something like the orbiter could be built and kept quiet, because the systems that would normally surface such a thing had been deliberately fragmented across too many competing interests to coordinate an exposure. The communities of survivors we see in Ark Raiders, the people living in the underground warrens and bunkers, carry a specific kind of bitterness about the world that was. It doesn't come through as simple nostalgia. There's an edge to it. The way older survivors describe the pre-Ark era in audio logs and written fragments suggests they are mourning something they also resented. They missed the convenience, they did not miss the system. And that emotional texture, that combination of grief and anger about what the old world was, points toward a society that already had serious cracks in it before the Ark ever fired its first shot. The lore about pre-Ark infrastructure is particularly dense around what the game calls the orbital layer. This is the zone of activity above the atmosphere that had become, in the final decades before the Ark descended, the most contested and least governed space on or above the planet. International treaties about orbital weapons existed, but the game's documents suggest they had been gradually undermined through technical workarounds, reclassifications, and the simple reality that enforcement in orbit was essentially impossible. What this means for our question about who built the orbiter is significant, because it tells us that whatever was up there, it didn't have to be hidden very hard. The economic picture the game paints is one of extreme concentration. A relatively small number of entities controlled the critical infrastructure of the pre-Ark world, and those entities had spent decades building legal and political frameworks that protected their ability to operate without meaningful oversight. The law references regulatory bodies that had become, through a slow process of capture and attrition, extensions of the industries they were supposed to regulate. Science was funded through channels that shaped what questions got asked. Defense research was distributed across private laboratories that had better facilities than most national programs. The world before the Ark was one in which the people with the most power had the most ability to keep their most significant work invisible. There is also an interesting thread in the early lore about what was known and not known by ordinary people in the pre-Ark world. The survivors we encounter in the game are a self-selecting group. They were the ones prepared enough, or lucky enough, or positioned well enough to survive the initial descent. But the fragments they carry about the old world suggest a population that was deliberately kept in a comfortable ignorance about what was actually being built above them. Not through active suppression, necessarily, but through the more mundane mechanism of information overload. There was so much happening, so much noise in the information environment, that genuinely alarming developments in orbital space could be published in technical papers and never surface in public consciousness. The game's lore about the months immediately before the Ark descended is particularly telling. One possible reading of several documents is that there were people who knew something significant was happening. Not that they knew exactly what was coming, but that they had seen enough in their work to understand that the orbital layer was doing something it shouldn't be doing. These people, whoever they were, made decisions in those final months that we can still trace through the aftermath. Some of them built bunkers, some of them filed reports that went nowhere, some of them disappeared from official records in ways that are hard to explain through ordinary circumstances, and some of them, the law seems to suggest, tried to stop it. Understanding the corporations that operated in the pre-Ark world means sitting with a lot of ambiguity, because the game deliberately doesn't give you clean corporate villains with logos and press releases. What it gives you instead are fragments of a system, procurement orders, internal memos with redacted names, references to projects identified only by code numbers. The law suggests an environment where accountability had been engineered out of the most sensitive work, not because everyone involved was malicious, but because the system had evolved to reward deniability. Knowing exactly who did what had become a liability rather than a feature in the world the Ark Raiders law describes. One of the more interesting structural choices the game makes is to give us access to the aftermath of decisions without always giving us the decisions themselves. We find the bodies, in a sense, but not always the weapon. We find the facilities, but not the authorization. We find the results of experiments we don't have the protocols for. This is partly a design choice, keeping the mystery alive, but it also mirrors something true about how large-scale technological catastrophe actually works. The most dangerous things that have ever happened to human societies rarely came with a single author. They came from systems, from accumulated choices, from individual decisions that seemed reasonable in isolation and catastrophic in aggregate. The pre-Ark world also had a specific relationship to failure that the law captures in interesting ways. The era described was one of technological triumphalism. The culture around science and industry in the period before the Ark was characterized by a belief that problems were solvable, that scale was always preferable to restraint, and that the downside risks of ambitious projects were acceptable given the potential upside. The survivors who look back on this era don't describe it with the language of deliberate evil. They describe it with the language of arrogance, of people who are very smart about how to build things and very poor at imagining what they were building toward. The law touches on a concept that comes up in several documents, which is the idea of threshold events. There seem to have been, in the final years before the Ark, a series of smaller incidents that were individually explainable, but collectively pointed towards something larger. Anomalies in satellite telemetry that were attributed to equipment failure, communication gaps that were logged as software errors, physical phenomena in the upper atmosphere that were classified before they could be properly studied. The picture these fragments paint is not of a sudden surprise, but of a slow accumulation of signs that a world running at maximum speed and minimum reflection chose not to read carefully. What the law suggests about the scientific community of the pre-Ark world is that it was deeply divided along lines that weren't always visible from the outside. There were researchers who were, by all institutional measures, doing legitimate science, and who were privately terrified of what some of their colleagues were working on. There were engineers who built things they couldn't fully explain, and signed off on projects whose second and third order consequences they hadn't been given enough information to evaluate. The Ark Raiders law doesn't present the scientific world of this era as uniformly complicit. It presents it as a community that had been structurally prevented from acting on what it knew, which is a different kind of indictment. The military dimension of the pre-Ark world deserves its own extended examination, and we'll get to it in later chapters, but for now, it's worth establishing that the law consistently positions military interest in orbital space as a primary driver of what happened. The game doesn't use simple language about this. It doesn't say the military built the orbiter. What it suggests is that military requirements shaped what was built, even when the actual construction was contracted out to civilian entities. The distinction between a military project and a military-funded civilian project is exactly the kind of semantic gap that allowed the most sensitive work to proceed without public scrutiny, and the law seems very aware of this. There is also a notable geographic dimension to the pre-Ark world that the law hints at without fully developing. The game doesn't present the pre-Ark period as a single unified human civilization making bad decisions together. It presents it as a fractured geopolitical landscape in which multiple powerful entities were racing against each other in orbital space. and in which the absence of genuine international governance meant that the most dangerous competition happened in the spaces between agreements. This matters for our central question because it means the orbiter, whatever it is, emerged from a context of competition rather than cooperation. It was built in an environment where the incentive was to go further and faster than a rival, not to stop and ask whether anyone should. The climate context of the pre-Ark world is referenced in several early documents, and it's worth noting because it establishes a specific kind of desperation in the political and scientific leadership of the era. The game suggests that the world before the Ark was already managing compounding crises. Environmental degradation, resource competition, political fragmentation, and a technological infrastructure that was becoming increasingly difficult to govern had created a leadership class that was, in the law's framing, genuinely frightened of what the next few decades held. This fear, this legitimate sense that things were on a trajectory that needed to be changed, is one possible explanation for why certain very extreme technological bets were made. Not out of cartoon villainy, but out of something more complicated and human. The documents that reference the period of approximately 15 to 20 years before the Ark's descent are some of the most interesting in the game's lore archive. This seems to have been the period in which the decisions that led to the Ark orbiter were made. And what strikes you about these documents is how ordinary most of them sound. Budget justifications, personnel requests, technical feasibility assessments, the machinery of bureaucracy, functioning more or less as it always does, but processing requests and authorizing expenditures that, when you know what they were leading toward, read very differently than they would have in their original context. There's something genuinely unsettling about that, about the way extraordinary things get built through very ordinary paperwork. The survivors in Ark Raiders carry a specific vocabulary that tells us something about how the pre-Ark world talked about what was happening in orbit. They use technical terms that are slightly off, the way that official language tends to obscure rather than clarify. They refer to programs by acronyms that were clearly designed to be uninformative. They remember hearing about developments in ways that were always framed as routine or minor, even when, in retrospect, they clearly weren't. The lore suggests that the pre-Ark world had developed a sophisticated system for making alarming things sound boring, which is one of the most effective forms of concealment ever invented. One possible reading of the earliest available documents is that the Ark orbiter was not originally conceived as a weapon. This point will become very important when we get into the corporate history in later chapters, but it's worth planting the seed now. The lore contains fragments that suggest an original purpose for whatever was being built in orbit that was framed, at least internally, as defensive or scientific. The transformation from that original framing to what the orbiter eventually became is one of the most significant and least documented transitions in the pre-Ark lore. Whether that transformation was planned from the beginning, or whether it represents a genuine drift from original intent, is one of the questions this video will keep returning to without ever being able to definitively answer. The economic models that drove investment in orbital space in the pre-Ark era are described with some specificity in the lore. There were clear financial incentives for certain kinds of orbital development that had nothing to do with weapons or alien contact or any of the more dramatic possibilities we'll discuss. Resource extraction from near-Earth objects was a genuine industry. Communications infrastructure was enormously profitable. Earth observation had become a competitive service with dozens of clients, ranging from governments to agricultural companies to financial firms that used satellite data for trading advantages. This normal, commercially logical ecosystem of orbital development was the cover under which more sensitive programs operated, and the law suggests that this was not an accident. The relationship between the pre-Ark world's intelligence services and its orbital programs is hinted at in several documents that reference classified assessments and joint working groups with unusual names. One possible reading is that the intelligence apparatus of the major powers had become, in the final decades before the Ark, the primary client for the most advanced orbital capabilities. Not in a simple spy satellite way, but in a more integrated sense. The orbital layer was, in the law's framing, an intelligence asset before it was anything else. And the organizations that managed intelligence had developed a proprietary relationship with what was up there that other parts of their own governments didn't fully understand. The law's treatment of time is interesting when it comes to the pre-Ark world. The game doesn't give you a precise chronology. It gives you the feeling of a long, slow build, years of decisions that compounded into decades of drift, until the thing that existed in orbit by the time the Ark descended was something that no single person had planned or fully understood. This is actually one of the most coherent readings of the available evidence. Large-scale technological catastrophes rarely come from a single moment of decision. They come from the accumulated weight of many smaller decisions made across long periods of time by people who could each, in isolation, have made a reasonable defense of their particular choice. The engineering community of the pre-Ark world is represented in the law through a few specific character types that keep appearing in documents. There are the idealists, researchers, and engineers who genuinely believed they were doing important work for human benefit. There are the careerists, people who didn't ask too many questions because the work was challenging and the pay was exceptional. There are the true believers, people who thought whatever was being built in orbit was necessary, who had been given enough of the real picture to believe the project was justified. And then there are the people who knew things that kept them awake at night, who filed internal objections that were quietly dismissed, who left their positions under circumstances that the official record describes as personal. These last people are the ones the law seems most interested in. The social fabric of the pre-Ark world, as reconstructed through survivor accounts and archived documents, was one of profound individualism. Not the romantic kind, but the institutional kind. People had been encouraged by economics and culture and the design of the information environment to frame their lives in terms of personal outcomes rather than collective ones. This had practical implications for how dangerous projects got built. The moral responsibility for any given piece of a large and dangerous system could be diffused across so many individual contributors, each making a small and locally defensible choice, that the system as a whole had no effective conscience. The law doesn't make this argument explicitly, but it's present in the structure of what happened. One of the most striking things about the pre-Ark law is what it suggests about public knowledge versus institutional knowledge. There are documents that indicate certain academic institutions and research organizations had, by the final decade before the Ark, produced analyses that pointed quite clearly toward the possibility of something catastrophic in the orbital layer. These analyses were not suppressed exactly. They were published, they went through peer review, they received responses from official sources that explained, using technically correct language, why the concerns were overstated or based on incomplete data. The pattern the law describes is one of legitimate scientific concern being neutralized not by censorship, but by procedural dismissal, which is, in some ways, more troubling. The pre-Ark world's infrastructure for managing catastrophic risk was, the law suggests, fundamentally inadequate to the situation it faced. There were agencies and bodies and international frameworks designed to handle known categories of threat, but the nature of what was developing in orbit fell outside the categories those frameworks had been built for. It wasn't biological, it wasn't nuclear exactly, it wasn't a conventional military threat. It occupied a space between categories, and the institutions designed to protect against catastrophic outcomes had no clear jurisdiction over something that fits so poorly into their existing taxonomy of danger. The law presents this not as a conspiracy, but as a structural failure, which is arguably scarier. The law contains references to a category of documents that survivors call the departure files. These are records of individuals, and in some cases, entire research teams who left official positions in the years and months immediately before the Ark descended. The circumstances of these departures are described in deliberately vague official language, but the pattern is consistent enough that one possible reading is that there was a significant loss of key personnel from orbital programs during this period. Whether these people left because they knew what was coming, or because they were removed because they were asking too many questions, or because of something else entirely, is not clearly established. But the departure files exist and the law treats them as significant. The communities that survived the Ark's initial descent didn't form randomly. The law suggests that the underground infrastructure, which became the basis for the survivor communities, was not entirely improvised. Some of it had been built earlier, in the pre-Ark world, by people or organizations that had known enough to prepare. This is one of the law's most pointed implications, that the capacity for survival was not evenly distributed across the pre-Ark world's population, that people with access to certain kinds of information were able to make preparations that ordinary people couldn't make because ordinary people didn't know they needed to. This asymmetry of survival is woven through the background of Ark Raiders in a way that adds a particular moral weight to the question of who built the orbiter. The culture of secrecy that surrounded orbital programs in the pre-Ark world created a specific kind of epistemic fragmentation that the law captures in interesting ways. People who worked on different parts of the same program often had no clear picture of what the overall program was doing. This was partly a deliberate security measure and partly an emergent property of the way large organizations work. The result was that even people who were very close to the most sensitive aspects of what was being built could maintain a kind of plausible deniability about the full implications of their work. The Ark Raiders law seems genuinely interested in this dynamic, not as an excuse, but as an explanation of how extraordinary things get built by ordinary people. The question of what was known at the highest levels of the pre-Ark power structure is one that the law deliberately leaves partially unanswered. There are documents that suggest awareness at very senior levels of something significant in the orbital layer, but awareness of what exactly is left unclear. One possible reading is that the senior leadership of the most powerful pre-Ark entities knew they had built something they didn't fully understand. Another reading is that they knew exactly what they had built and chose to proceed anyway. The law supports both interpretations depending on which documents you weight more heavily, and I'll come back to this tension repeatedly throughout the video. The physical geography of the pre-Ark world matters for our investigation in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The game suggests that the facilities most relevant to the Ark orbiter's creation were distributed across multiple jurisdictions, in some cases deliberately. Operations that needed to happen in one regulatory environment were conducted there, while operations that needed a different kind of cover operated elsewhere. The law hints at a network of locations, some of which have survived in fragmentary form as structures players can find, that form the physical infrastructure of whatever program produced the orbiter. Tracing that network is part of what this video is trying to do. The law about pre-Ark communications infrastructure is worth noting here because it establishes something important about the orbiter's relationship to the world below. The orbital layer of the pre-Ark world was, by the game's account, saturated with communication signals of various kinds. This is relevant because it means that anything operating in orbit had both the cover of a crowded signal environment and the challenge of remaining undetected within it. Several documents suggest that unusual signal patterns in the orbital layer were detected and logged by multiple independent monitoring systems in the years before the Ark descended, and that the official explanations for these patterns were not universally accepted by the technical staff who reviewed them. The labour practices of the pre-Ark orbital industry are described in ways that tell us something about the culture of the organisations involved. There are references to personnel policies designed to minimise knowledge transfer out of sensitive programs, non-disclosure agreements with scope clauses that effectively covered workers' entire professional knowledge in an area, security clearances that made it difficult for individuals to consult with external parties about technical problems, compartmentalized project structures that ensured no single employee had a full picture of what they were building. The law presents these practices not as unusual for the era, but as the standard operating environment for anyone working in the most sensitive parts of the orbital economy. One of the most interesting pieces of pre-arc law concerns what the game calls the anomaly reports. These were, apparently, a category of internal document that circulated within certain organizations in the final years before the Ark's descent. They described observations of orbital phenomena that didn't fit the parameters of any publicly known program. The formal response to these reports, as documented in several accessible files, was a combination of reclassification and reinterpretation. The unusual readings were explained to those who submitted them as artifacts of measurement error or as expected properties of newly deployed systems. The people who filed the reports were, the law suggests, generally satisfied with these explanations at the time, though not all of them. The pre-Arc world's media environment is described in the game's lore in ways that feel specifically relevant to how the orbiter's existence was kept out of public discourse. There are references to a media landscape that was simultaneously information-saturated and structurally incentivized against deep investigative engagement with technical subjects. The combination of complex technical material, classified sources, and a news cycle optimized for immediate comprehension meant that the kind of slow-developing story that the orbiter's creation represented was almost impossible to surface through the channels that reached ordinary people. The law doesn't suggest an active media suppression campaign. It suggests a system that had evolved to be, by its very nature, blind to certain kinds of truth. The generation of scientists and engineers who built the critical infrastructure of the pre-Arc orbital layer were, the law suggests, shaped by a specific set of professional incentives that are worth understanding. They had been trained in institutions that valued technical achievement above all else. They worked in organizations that measured success by capability delivered rather than consequence avoided. They were compensated at levels that created significant personal investment in the continuation of whatever program employed them. And they operated in a culture where asking certain kinds of questions about the purpose or implications of one's work was understood, if not explicitly stated, to be professionally dangerous. The law presents this as a human system, rather than a malicious conspiracy, which makes it, in some ways, harder to locate blame. The final point worth making about the pre-Arc world, before we move into the specific story of the corporations, is this. The law consistently presents the world before the Arc not as a world that was destroyed by a random external event, but as a world that had, through a very long series of decisions, positioned itself to be vulnerable in exactly the way that it eventually was. This doesn't mean the Ark was built by humans, and it doesn't mean the catastrophe was deliberate or inevitable. What it means is that the decisions made in the pre-Ark world created conditions in which something like the Ark orbiter was possible. Whether it was built or arrived or was awakened by what humanity was doing in orbit, the pre-Ark world made the encounter possible. And understanding that world is the foundation on which everything else in this investigation rests. The ghost of the pre-Arc world shows up in Arc Raiders in 100 small ways, in the architecture of bunkers built to survive exactly the kind of assault that eventually came, in the specific technical vocabulary that survivors used to describe what fell from the sky, in the equipment that players find on the surface, pieces of technology that are almost human but slightly wrong, slightly advanced in ways that suggest either extraordinary acceleration or a different origin entirely. The pre-Arc world left traces, and those traces, when you read them carefully, point in a direction. Not clearly, not without ambiguity, but directionally. And that direction leads us toward the organizations that had the most to gain from whatever was built in orbit. There is a particular document that circulates among the most committed Arc Raiders lore community, one of those fragments that has generated enormous discussion because it seems to describe, in unusually direct terms, a meeting that took place roughly 18 months before the Ark descended. The document is incomplete. The names of participants are redacted. The specific technical subject under discussion is referred to only by a project designation that doesn't appear in any other accessible record. But the tone of the document and a few specific phrases that slipped through whatever review process was applied to it suggest that this was a meeting at which people who knew the full picture of what was in orbit discussed what was going to happen. And the discussion, to the extent the surviving fragments allow us to read it, was not about stopping it. The question that the pre-Ark law ultimately forces us to confront is the question of complicity. Not in a legal sense, because the legal structures of the pre-Ark world were, by the game's account, inadequate to address what happened. But in a deeper, more human sense, if the Ark orbiter was, to any meaningful degree, a product of human decisions, then the destruction it brought was not purely external. It was in some measure self-inflicted. The law doesn't say this directly, but it builds a picture of a world that had the information it needed to make different choices, and through a combination of institutional incentive, political inertia, and very human short-term thinking, chose not to. The Ark Raiders lore is not primarily a story about an alien attack. It is primarily a story about what kind of world invites that attack, and then doesn't see it coming, even when people are standing at windows pointing. Chapter 2. The Corporation that Owned the Sky. The story of who built the Ark orbiter cannot be told without spending serious time on the corporate entities that operated in orbital space in the pre-Ark era, and of all the organizations the game's lore touches on, none appears more frequently or in more contexts than the entity generally referred to in surviving documents as the primary orbital contractor. The game doesn't give this organization a single clean name across all its documents, which is itself a piece of evidence. Large organizations don't usually obscure their own names unless the name creates a problem. The fact that this entity appears under multiple designations in the available lore suggests either a history of rebranding, which was common in the pre-Ark corporate world, or a deliberate strategy of distributing its identity across subsidiary entities to prevent any single name from accumulating too much scrutiny. The earliest references to this organization in the accessible lore describe it as a defense and aerospace contractor that had, over several decades, expanded from its original focus on propulsion systems into a much broader portfolio. The lore suggests that this expansion was not random. It followed a specific pattern of acquiring capabilities in areas that were adjacent to whatever the organization's core program actually was. You see references to acquisitions in materials science, in orbital mechanics, in artificial intelligence research, in deep space communication technology. Taken individually, each of these acquisitions had a plausible commercial justification. Taken together, they look like the systematic assembly of a specific set of capabilities by an organization that had a very precise plan for how those capabilities would eventually be integrated. The corporate leadership that guided this organization through its expansion period is described in fragments that are maddeningly partial. There are references to a founding leadership team that was unusual in its composition, mixing people with deep government and intelligence backgrounds, with scientists who had previously worked on programs that are themselves partially obscured in the record. One possible reading is that the organization was, from relatively early in its history, a vehicle for a specific program that had government-level resources and corporate-level deniability. This is not an unusual structure for sensitive projects in the pre-Ark world, but the scale and duration of what this organization apparently did places it in a different category than most. The financial history of this organization is one of the more interesting puzzles in the Ark Raiders lore. The revenues visible in public records don't fully account for the capabilities the organization apparently possessed. There are gaps, infrastructure that was built and operated that doesn't appear to have been funded by identifiable commercial contracts, personnel budgets that imply a workforce significantly larger than what can be accounted for by the visible business operations. The most straightforward explanation is that a significant portion of the organization's revenue came from classified government contracts that didn't appear in commercial records. The law doesn't contradict this reading, but it also plants enough ambiguity to suggest that the funding picture may have been even more complex. The relationship between this organization and the various national governments it dealt with is described in ways that suggest an unusual degree of leverage running in both directions. Governments needed what the organization could provide. The organization needed government authorization for certain kinds of orbital operations. This mutual dependency created a relationship that was, according to several documents, characterized by a negotiated ambiguity about exactly what was being authorized and for what purpose. There are references to legal frameworks that had been specifically created to govern this relationship, frameworks that appear to have been unusually flexible in how they defined the boundaries of permitted activity. The law suggests that this flexibility was not accidental. One of the most consistently referenced elements of this organization's culture in the available documents is its internal hierarchy of knowledge. Not everyone in the organization knew the same things. There was a tiered system of access, not just to classified information, but to the organization's own internal understanding of what it was actually doing. Lower tiers knew their specific functions. Middle tiers knew enough to coordinate those functions, but the law suggests that the complete picture of what the organization was working toward was known to a very small group, and the information management practices around this inner circle were, by the accounts available, extraordinarily careful. People at lower levels didn't always know they were missing information. They had been given a picture that was internally consistent. It was just incomplete. The physical infrastructure this organization maintained is referenced across multiple documents and environmental details in ARC Raiders. There are facilities on multiple continents. There are offshore platforms. There are deep facility installations that appear in survivor accounts as places that were known to exist, but whose purpose was never publicly described. And there are intriguingly references to installations in space that go beyond what the organization's publicly known commercial activities would require. The law suggests that the organization's orbital footprint, the actual physical presence it maintained above the atmosphere, was substantially larger than what was disclosed in any public record. And the nature of that undisclosed infrastructure is directly relevant to the question of what the ARC orbiter is and where it came from. The personnel records that survive from this organization are particularly interesting because of who appears in them. There are names, where names have survived redaction, that connect to programs in other parts of the pre-ARC record. Scientists who appear in academic publications on subjects relevant to the ARC's known behavior. Engineers who appear in patent filings for technologies that look, in retrospect, like components of what the orbiter does. Intelligence figures who were officially in other positions but who appear in organizational charts in ways that suggest they had real operational roles. The law builds a picture of an organization that was, in personnel terms, a convergence point for the people who were working on the most significant and sensitive questions in the pre-ARC world. The organizational culture of this entity, reconstructed from internal communications and survivor recollections, was one of intense loyalty and intense compartmentalization. People who worked there were, by accounts, extraordinarily committed to their work and to each other. The organization provided for its people in ways that created genuine personal investment in its success. But the same culture that created loyalty also created insularity. People inside the organization tended to evaluate questions of ethics and consequence through the organization's own frameworks, rather than external ones. This is not unusual in organizations of this type, but the law suggests it reached an unusual intensity one that would have made it difficult for individual conscience to surface concerns through internal channels. There are references in several documents to what the organisation called the primary mandate. This term appears in different contexts, but it consistently refers to something that supersedes commercial or governmental obligations. The primary mandate is never fully described in any accessible document. It is referenced as a known thing by people writing to other people who clearly understand what it means. One possible reading is that the primary mandate was the actual purpose of the organisation, the real reason it existed, as distinct from whatever commercial or governmental work provided its cover and funding. The law doesn't tell us what that mandate was, but it treats it as something that was known to a specific tier of the organisation and that shaped every significant decision the organisation made. The organisation's work on orbital mechanics is one of the most technically detailed areas of the law, and it's interesting because of what it implies about capability. The documents that reference this work suggest a level of orbital engineering sophistication that was significantly ahead of what was publicly known in the pre-arc world. Not in an implausible science fiction way, but in the specific, practical way that comes from having more resources and more time to work on specific problems than any publicly acknowledged program. The law suggests that this organisation had solved engineering problems related to sustained orbital operation that other players in the space industry were still treating as open challenges. That kind of capability advantage is significant because it means the organisation could build things in orbit that other entities literally didn't know were possible. The relationship between this organisation and the scientific community is described in ways that suggest a pattern of talent absorption. The most capable people working on subjects relevant to the organisation's core work had a tendency to move into positions connected to the organisation, not always directly employed, sometimes consultants, sometimes members of advisory bodies, sometimes researchers at academic institutions that receive significant funding from the organisation. The law suggests that the organisation maintained a comprehensive awareness of who was working on what in the fields it cared about, and that it had developed mechanisms for ensuring that significant independent progress in those fields was either incorporated into its own work or, in some cases, redirected away from lines of inquiry that the organisation preferred to keep within its own walls. The political connections of this organisation in the pre-arc world are described as extensive and deliberately distributed. The law suggests that the organisation had cultivated relationships across the political spectrum of multiple major powers, not because it had political preferences, but because political access was a resource that needed to be maintained regardless of which parties or factions held power at any given moment. There are references to individuals who served the organisation's interests in positions of governmental authority without being formally employed by it, to regulatory officials who understood that certain subjects were not to be pressed, to intelligence figures who ensured that information about the organisation's activities was managed in ways that protected its operational security. The picture is not of a corrupt organisation in a simple sense. It is of an organisation that had become, over decades, structurally integrated into the pre-arc world's power architecture. The law contains several references to what might be called the organisation's parallel history. The official history, reconstructed from public records, shows a successful aerospace and defence contractor with a strong commercial track record and a significant portfolio of government contracts. The parallel history, suggested by the documents that survived the Ark's descent and the fragmentary survivor accounts, is of something considerably more ambitious. An organisation that had been, for a significant period of its existence, working toward an objective that had nothing to do with its commercial portfolio. And that objective, the law points toward, involved the orbital layer in ways that were fundamental to what eventually became the Ark. The technical vocabulary used in the organization's internal documents is one of the most valuable sources of evidence for what it was actually doing. Technical language is hard to fully obscure because it carries implicit meaning that ordinary redaction doesn't address. The terminology that appears in accessible fragments includes references to non-terrestrial interfaces, to resonant orbital structures, to adaptive material configurations, and to what one document calls the convergence architecture. These terms don't appear in any publicly known program of the pre-ARC era. They describe concepts that are, in several cases, consistent with what the ARC orbiter appears to be and do. One possible reading is that these terms were developed internally to describe properties of a system that the organization had either built, discovered, or been given access to. The organization's response to the anomaly reports mentioned in the previous chapter is one of the more telling pieces of evidence in the available lore. When the anomaly reports were filed by personnel working in adjacent programs, the response was managed with what appears to have been practiced efficiency. The explanations provided were technically detailed enough to satisfy most questioners. The few individuals who pressed further found their professional circumstances becoming complicated in ways that were, individually, explainable through ordinary organizational dynamics. The law doesn't describe intimidation. It describes something more subtle. A consistent pattern of the most persistent questioners finding themselves redirected, promoted sideways, reassigned to less sensitive areas, or otherwise moved away from lines of inquiry the organization preferred not to have pursued. The question of whether this organization built the ARC orbiter, found it, or did something in between is one that the available law doesn't answer cleanly. But it does establish that the organization was, in orbital terms, the entity with the greatest capability and the least transparency. It was operating at the intersection of the technology, the resources, and the secrecy required to have been involved in whatever the orbiter is, and the pattern of its behavior in the years before the ARC's descent, the acquisitions, the personnel movements, the anomaly responses, the departures, the preparation of survival infrastructure for specific individuals. All of it is consistent with an organization that knew more about what was coming than it ever disclosed. The subsidiaries and affiliated entities that orbited this organization, in a figurative sense, form a significant part of the evidentiary picture. The law references multiple smaller organizations that appear on examination to have been functionally integrated with the primary contractor even when they were formally independent. Research institutes, technical consultancies, material suppliers with unusually exclusive relationships. These affiliated entities provided the organizational complexity that made comprehensive oversight difficult. A regulatory inquiry or an intelligence assessment focused on any single entity would see only a portion of the whole. The distributed nature of the operation was itself a security feature. One of the most haunting pieces of law associated with this organization concerns its final operational period. In the months immediately before the ARC descended, the organizational records suggest a pattern of activity that is hard to explain through normal business operations. Certain facilities appear to have been systematically depopulated of personnel. Specific data archives appear to have been transferred to locations that are not readily identifiable from the records. Equipment and materials whose presence in certain locations is documented in earlier records do not appear in later records. Something was being wound down or moved or prepared, and the timing of these activities, measured against what we know about when the ARC descended, is deeply suggestive. The individuals who were at the operational leadership level of this organization in its final period are almost universally absent from the survivor record. There is no account of what happened to them. They don't appear in the communities of survivors. They don't appear in the records of fatalities that various survivor groups maintained. They are simply absent. One possible reading is that they did not survive the Ark's initial descent. Another is that they survived in conditions that have simply not been documented in the accessible record. A third possibility, which the lore is careful to leave open, is that they are still somewhere, in ways that complicate the story of the Ark Orbiter rather than simplifying it. The legacy of this organisation in the survivor communities is described in ways that range from bitter contempt to complicated reverence. Some survivors blame the organisation, or the entities associated with it, for the Ark's descent. Others credit it with having built the infrastructure that made survival possible. Both of these assessments may be correct simultaneously, which is the kind of moral ambiguity the Ark Raiders lore is consistently interested in. The same entity that may have contributed to the catastrophe may also have ensured that some humans survived it. That kind of dual legacy is very human, in the most uncomfortable sense of the word. The physical remnants of the organization's infrastructure that appear in Ark Raiders as explorable locations are some of the most information-rich environments in the game. The facilities that survived the Ark's descent, or were built deeply enough to survive it, contain documents and equipment and physical evidence that paint a picture of an operation that was far more sophisticated and far stranger than its official description. Players who spend time in these locations encounter material that suggests research beyond the boundaries of what was publicly possible in the pre-Ark era. Equipment that looks like nothing in the commercially available inventory of the time. Documents that reference capabilities and events in language that remains difficult to parse even with full access. The organization's work on what the lore calls adaptive systems is particularly relevant to the Ark Orbiter. The documents that reference this work describe a category of research focused on systems that could modify their own behavior in response to environmental conditions, not through simple programmed responses, but through something more organic. The language used to describe adaptive systems research in the accessible fragments is strikingly similar to the language used by survivors who have studied the Ark's machines up close. The way Ark machines respond to novel situations, the way they learn and adjust, the quality of their behavior that players find most unsettling, the sense that they are not just executing instructions, but making something like decisions. This similarity in description doesn't prove a connection, but it suggests one. The organization's relationship with space is described in several documents in terms that go beyond engineering and commerce. There are references to what the organization called the long view, an internal framework for thinking about the organization's purpose in terms of decades and centuries rather than quarters and years. The long view, to the extent the surviving fragments describe it, involved a specific set of beliefs about what humanity's relationship with the wider universe would eventually require, and about what role an organization like this one should play in preparing for that encounter. This philosophical dimension of the organization's identity is easy to dismiss as corporate self-mythology, but it appears consistently enough in the available material that it seems to have been more than rhetorical. It seems to have been genuinely operational. The Ark Raiders' lore about the organization's final communications is fragmentary but suggestive. There are references to transmissions sent in the period immediately before the Ark descended that appear to have been directed upward rather than laterally or downward. The content of these transmissions is not described in any accessible document. The fact that they were made is, and the timing, combined with the direction of the transmissions, is one of the more direct pieces of evidence the lore offers for a specific theory about what this organization's relationship with the Ark Orbiter actually was. Not that it built it from scratch, but that it knew it was there, had been in contact with it, and understood what was about to happen in ways that no one else did. The question of what this organization knew, and when it knew it is, in some ways, the central question of the Ark Raiders lore. Because if it knew what was in orbit, it had obligations that it appears not to have met. And if it didn't know, then the question of how an organization of this sophistication and capability missed something of this magnitude becomes almost as troubling as the alternative. The law doesn't resolve this tension. It holds it and lets you sit with both possibilities, because both have something true to say about the world the Ark Raiders' law is describing. The surviving documents make a strong case that this organization was at minimum the entity on Earth that had the most complete understanding of what the Ark Orbiter was before it revealed itself. Whether that understanding came from having built parts of it, from having studied it, from having communicated with it, or from some combination of these, the evidence points consistently toward this organization as the human entity most connected to the orbiter. And that connection, whatever its precise nature, makes the organization the most important single thread in the investigation this video is pursuing. The organizational documents that reference what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Ark's initial descent are among the most significant pieces of evidence available. They describe a response that was coordinated in ways that suggest advanced preparation. Not the improvised response of an organization caught off guard, but the execution of something that had been planned and prepared for. The underground installations that became survival infrastructure for certain populations were activated according to what appear to be pre-established protocols. Specific equipment was moved to protected locations. Specific communications were established. The response was, in a word, ready. And an organization that is ready for something that no one else anticipated is an organization that knew something no one else knew. The ethical dimension of this organization's history is the hardest part to write about, without sliding into either condemnation or excuse-making, neither of which does justice to the complexity the law actually presents. The people who built and ran this organization were, by all available evidence, genuinely intelligent, and in many cases, genuinely motivated by something they believed was important. The long view they operated under was not a simple cover story. It represented a real belief that what they were doing mattered at a scale that ordinary ethical frameworks weren't equipped to address. This doesn't excuse the outcomes, but it does mean that the story of this organization is not one of simple villainy. It is one of genuine human complexity operating at genuinely dangerous scale. The technical capabilities this organization had developed in the years before the Ark descended are described in the law in ways that suggest they had solved several problems that the wider scientific community was still treating as distant challenges. Sustained energy generation in orbital conditions. Material properties relevant to withstanding the stresses of long-duration space operation. Communication protocols capable of functioning across the interference conditions that characterize the orbital layer. Each of these capabilities individually would represent a significant advance over what was publicly known. Together, they represent a technical foundation for something that would need to operate in orbit for an extended period. The Ark Orbiter has been in orbit for an extended period. The connection is not proof, but it is suggestive. One possible reading of the overall corporate history is that this organization was not the originator of the Ark Orbiter, but the most recent human entity to be involved with it. The law supports a reading in which the orbiter predates the organization's active involvement with it, and in which what the organization did was discover, investigate, and eventually incorporate something that was already present in the orbital layer. This reading changes the moral picture considerably. It shifts the question from did they build this weapon to did they know what they were dealing with and proceed anyway. And on that version of the question, the law provides a fairly consistent answer. The organization had rivals in the pre-Ark world, and the law's treatment of those rivalries is interesting. There are references to competing organizations that had similar capabilities and similar interest in the orbital layer, but that appear to have operated with less complete information. The primary contractor seems to have had an advantage in terms of what it knew about the orbiter, and that advantage shaped the dynamics of competition. Rivals were allowed to develop capabilities that were useful to the primary contractor. Information was managed to maintain the competitive advantage. The picture is of an organization that was, in the orbital domain, operating with a fundamental information asymmetry that it had no intention of resolving. The law contains references to internal debates within the organization about what to do with what it knew. What? These references are fragmentary, but suggest that the decision to proceed with whatever the organization ultimately did, rather than to disclose what it had found, was not universally supported internally. There appear to have been people at significant levels of the organization who believed that what they knew needed to be shared more broadly, that the potential consequences of keeping it contained within the organization were too large. These people were overruled. The mechanism of their overruling is not clearly described in the available documents, but the fact that they existed and that their position did not prevail is one of the most significant pieces of information the law provides. The organization's legacy in the post-Ark world is complicated by the fact that some of what it built has kept people alive. The infrastructure it constructed, the protocols it established, the technical knowledge it preserved, these things have genuine value in the world the Ark created. Survivors benefit, directly and indirectly, from preparations that this organization made. This creates a moral situation that the Ark Raiders law refuses to simplify. The same entity whose choices may have contributed to the catastrophe also provided the tools that some people used to survive it. This is not exoneration, but it is, in the law's treatment, part of the full picture. The question of whether the organization still exists in some form in the post-Ark world is one that the law leaves tantalizingly open. There are references in some documents to protocols that continue to be executed according to pre-Ark plans, to communications that continue to follow pre-established parameters, to systems that are still operating in ways that suggest they have active management rather than simply running on pre-programmed defaults. If the organization still exists in some form, then the investigation into who built the Ark orbiter becomes not just a historical inquiry, but a question with current operational relevance. And the law, characteristically, plants the possibility without confirming it. The final assessment of the primary orbital contractor's role in the Ark orbiter's story is this: it was almost certainly the human entity most centrally involved in whatever happened in orbit. Whether its involvement was as creator, discoverer, collaborator, or something more ambiguous, the evidence points consistently toward this organization as the most significant human actor in the orbiter's history. The scale of its capabilities, the pattern of its behavior, the timing of its preparations, and the nature of its relationship with the orbital layer all point in the same direction. What the organization did with that involvement, and whether it could have made different choices at the critical moments, is the human tragedy at the center of the Ark Raiders lore. Chapter 3: The Blueprints of Annihilation. Before we can properly ask who built the Ark orbiter, we need to be precise about what the Ark orbiter actually is. This seems obvious, but it turns out to be surprisingly difficult, because the lore around the orbiter's physical nature is one of the most carefully ambiguous areas of the game's world building. The orbiter is described, observed, and referenced in dozens of documents and survivor accounts, but those descriptions don't converge on a single, clean physical picture. They converge on something more complicated, a structure that seems to behave differently in different observations, a thing that doesn't quite fit the categories that even the most technically sophisticated survivors bring to it. And understanding why those descriptions diverge is itself an important piece of evidence. The most basic description of the Ark orbiter in the accessible lore is that it is a large structure in a relatively stable orbit above Earth. The geometry of that orbit is described in technical terms that suggest it is not a natural orbit, meaning it requires active correction to maintain, which in turn means it has a power source, and something operating that power source. The altitude varies in different accounts, which could mean different observers are describing different things, or that the orbit itself is not fixed. One possible reading is that the orbiter occupies multiple orbital altitudes at different times, which would explain the discrepancy and would also require extraordinary engineering to achieve. The physical scale of the orbiter is described in ways that produce inconsistent numbers. Some accounts suggest dimensions consistent with a large space station, others suggest something considerably larger. The discrepancy is interesting because large orbital structures are large in ways that are physically measurable, and if different observers are genuinely measuring the same object and getting different results, that suggests either very different measurement methods or something strange about the object's physical properties. The law doesn't resolve this inconsistency. It preserves it, which is a choice, because resolving it would close off possibilities that the narrative wants to keep open. The visible surface of the orbiter, as described by survivors who have observed it through telescopic equipment or who have had access to pre-arc observational data, is one of the more unsettling aspects of its description. It is not described as a clean, manufactured surface. It is described as something that looks both constructed and organic simultaneously. There are regular, geometric elements that suggest deliberate design, and there are irregular, biological-looking features that suggest growth or accumulation. The combination is described in multiple independent accounts as deeply wrong-feeling in a way that goes beyond simple aesthetic strangeness. People who observe the orbiter through magnification tend to describe a visceral discomfort that they find difficult to articulate precisely. The material composition of what the orbiter is made of is one of the most significant questions the law raises, and the answer, suggested by various documents, is deeply interesting. There are references to components of the orbiter that have material properties inconsistent with anything in the pre-arc engineering record. Materials that are simultaneously dense and light in ways that conventional physics doesn't accommodate. Surfaces that appear to absorb certain wavelengths of radiation, while reflecting others in patterns that don't match any known material's spectral signature. The technical documents that describe these properties do so with the careful language of scientists trying to be precise about something they genuinely don't understand, which makes them considerably more credible as evidence than more sensational descriptions. The power source of the arc orbiter is addressed in several documents with varying degrees of technical detail, and the consistent picture that emerges is of an energy output that is, by any reasonable accounting, impossible for a human-built structure of the orbiter's apparent size. The orbiter generates and expends energy at scales that would require a power source far beyond anything that was in the pre-arc world's engineering vocabulary. This is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that the orbiter, whatever its origin, incorporates technology that was either beyond human capability at the time of its construction or has been augmented by something non-human. The law allows for both readings. The machines that the orbiter sends to the surface, what survivors call the arc, are described in ways that connect back to the orbiter itself in interesting technical ways. The material composition of arc machines recovered by radars contains elements and structures that are consistent with descriptions of the orbiter's own surface material. This suggests a functional and physical continuity between the orbiter and the machines it produces. They are not manufactured separately and then launched. They appear to be produced from or by the orbiter itself, which has implications for what the orbiter is at a fundamental level. A weapon launches projectiles. What the orbiter does is closer to reproduction. The law about the orbiter's internal structure is necessarily incomplete because no human character in the accessible record has entered it and returned. But there are references to sensor data collected from orbit by pre-arc programs and survivor analysis of debris from arc machines. That together suggests something about the orbiter's internal organization. The picture these fragments sketch is not of a hollow structure with discrete rooms and systems, as a human space station would have. It is of something more continuous, more integrated. a structure where the distinction between interior and exterior is not as clear as in human engineering, where the functional systems are distributed through the material rather than assembled from components. This description, if accurate, has enormous implications for the question of who built it. The way the orbiter interacts with the electromagnetic environment around it is described in technical documents with language that suggests active rather than passive behavior. The orbiter doesn't just sit in orbit emitting and receiving signals as a passive structure would. It appears to shape the electromagnetic environment in its vicinity. It generates interference patterns that affect other orbital objects. It responds to certain kinds of electromagnetic stimulation in ways that suggest it is monitoring and processing information from the environment. This active electromagnetic behavior is consistent with descriptions of how arc machines behave on the surface. The sense that they are constantly gathering and processing information rather than simply executing fixed programs. The debris field associated with the arc orbiter is itself a significant piece of evidence for its nature. Space objects accumulate debris fields over time, but the character of the debris field around the orbiter is described as unusual. The debris contains material consistent with human origin hardware, which suggests that the orbiter has encountered, and in some cases incorporated, human-built orbital infrastructure. But it also contains material of unknown origin, material that appears to have been in orbit for far longer than any human space program, material whose composition suggests fabrication rather than natural origin, but fabrication using processes and materials that predate any identifiable human technology. The age estimate of some of this debris material, drawn from technical documents that reference dating analyses, suggests a presence in the orbital layer that significantly predates the pre-arc era. The visual appearance of the arc orbiter from the ground is described in survivor accounts with a specific consistency that is worth noting. It is described as visible under certain conditions, not as a simple point of light like a satellite, but as something with apparent structure. On clear nights, particularly in areas where the arc's activity has cleared other interference from the visual environment, survivors describe being able to see something that has form, that has what one account describes as intention in its appearance. This is not scientific evidence, it is phenomenological, a description of how the orbiter looks and feels to human observers. But phenomenological evidence in the arc radar's lore consistently proves to be tracking something real. The orbiter's relationship to Earth's atmosphere is described in technical terms that suggest it has an active rather than passive effect on atmospheric conditions. There are references to atmospheric phenomena in the vicinity of arc descent events that are not consistent with the simple ballistic behavior of objects falling from orbit. The thermal signatures, pressure changes, and electrical phenomena associated with arc descent suggest that the orbiter is doing something to the atmosphere that goes beyond simply launching objects through it. One possible reading is that the orbiter is using the atmosphere itself as part of the delivery mechanism for whatever it sends down. Another is that the atmospheric effects are byproducts of a process that primarily serves a different function. The law's treatment of the arc orbiter's apparent age is one of the most significant elements of the case for non-human origin. Multiple documents reference analyses of the orbiter's material composition that suggest it predates any human orbital program. The confidence levels on these age estimates vary, and the methodology is described in general terms rather than specific ones, which limits how much weight to put on any single estimate. But the consistency of the direction, every estimate pointing toward an origin before any human space program could have built it, is significant. If the orbiter is genuinely old in the way these analyses suggest, then the question of who built it cannot be answered with reference to any human organization or time period. It has to be answered differently. The behaviour of the arc orbiter over the observed period since the game's events begin is one of the more analytically interesting aspects of the law. The orbiter is not static, it changes. The rate of material it sends to the surface has varied. Its electromagnetic behaviour has evolved. Its apparent physical configuration, to the extent it can be observed, appears to have changed over time. This ongoing change is consistent with two very different interpretations. One is that the orbiter is a machine executing a program, and what looks like change is actually the sequential execution of pre-planned phases. The other is that the orbiter is adapting, responding to conditions on the surface and in the orbital environment, and that what looks like change is actually something more like learning. The law supports both readings. The sound of the orbiter is referenced in survivor accounts in ways that seem initially dismissible, but which appear too consistently to be simply atmospheric or psychological. Certain survivors who have operated near active arc descent zones describe a specific quality of sound that they associate with the orbiter's activity. Not a sound exactly, but a sensation in the physical environment that gets described with acoustic language, because that's the closest available vocabulary. This description appears in accounts from survivors who have no apparent connection to each other, using similar but independently generated language. One possible reading is that the orbiter generates something in the low frequency range that humans can detect but not clearly categorize as sound. The implications of a structure that uses low-frequency signals as part of its operation are, in the context of what the arc does to the surface, worth considering. The relationship between the arc orbiter and the machines it produces is described in ways that suggest continuous rather than periodic communication. Arc machines on the surface appear to maintain an ongoing connection to something, and the most natural candidate for that something is the orbiter. The nature of this connection, whether it is a simple command and control channel or something more like a distributed nervous system, is not resolved in the accessible law. But several documents note that arc machines whose connection to the orbiter appears to have been disrupted behave differently than machines with intact connection, not randomly, but differently, as if operating from stored instructions rather than live guidance. This distinction matters for understanding what the arc machines are and what their relationship to the orbiter means. The technical analysis of arc machines recovered by raiders produces a picture that is consistent with origination from the orbiter. The material structure of arc machines contains components whose fabrication process appears to be identical to processes that would explain the orbiter's own surface composition. The internal architecture of arc machines, to the extent it can be analysed without destroying the machine, shows organisational principles that are similar across all observed machines, and which are also consistent with descriptions of the orbiter's internal structure inferred from other sources. This structural consistency suggests that arc machines and the arc orbiter are products of the same process, and that process is not one that human engineering of the pre-arc era was capable of. The question of whether the arc orbiter was built, grew, or arrived is one that the law keeps returning to without resolving. Built implies manufacture by intelligent agents according to a plan. Grew implies a process more biological than mechanical, a development over time driven by internal processes rather than external design. Arrived implies that it came from somewhere else, complete or partially complete, rather than being constructed in the orbital layer. The available evidence is frustratingly compatible with all three possibilities, which is why the investigation has to engage with each seriously, rather than dismissing any of them prematurely. The way arc machines interact with human-built structures tells us something about the orbiter's apparent priorities. The selective nature of what the arc targets, the pattern of what it destroys versus what it leaves alone, is discussed in several survivor documents with genuine analytical interest. There are patterns. The arc is not randomly destructive. It appears to target specific categories of infrastructure, while leaving others relatively untouched. The pattern of targeting is discussed in the law as a subject of active investigation by survivors, because understanding the targeting logic could tell you something important about what the ARC's program actually is. And what it tells you, if you follow the implications, loops back to questions about the orbiter's origin and purpose. The electromagnetic emissions of the ARC orbiter, as described in technical documents, include a specific category of signal that is referenced as the carrier. The carrier is described as a broadband emission that appears to underpin the communication between the orbiter and its machines on the surface. It is not a simple directional transmission. It appears to be something more ambient, a background signal that covers a wide area and through which more specific communications are embedded. The technical properties of the carrier, as described in available documents, are consistent with a communication architecture that is far more sophisticated than anything in the pre-ARC human communications inventory. This is another piece of evidence for non-human design, or for human design incorporating non-human technology. The way the orbiter handles the solar environment is described in technical terms that suggest active management rather than passive accommodation. Solar events that should, according to conventional orbital mechanics, create difficulties for systems in the orbiter's orbital position appear to have minimal effect on the orbiter's operation. The orbiter continues to function through solar events that would disable conventional human satellites. The explanation for this resilience, to the extent one is offered in the available documents, is that the orbiter's material composition provides a degree of protection from electromagnetic and radiation events that goes beyond what any known material could provide. This is consistent with the earlier description of the orbiter's surface material having properties inconsistent with any human origin engineering. The ARC machines sent to the surface vary in design and apparent function in ways that suggest the orbiter has a complex operating architecture rather than a single purpose. Some ARC machines are clearly oriented toward direct engagement with human structures or survivors. Others appear to be engaged in processes that look more like environmental survey or resource collection. Still others exhibit behaviors that don't fit neatly into either category and which have generated significant discussion in the survivor law community about what they are actually doing. The diversity of ARC machine types points toward an orbiter that is managing multiple simultaneous objectives, which in turn suggests a complexity of purpose that goes beyond simple destruction. The law's references to ARC machine behavior in the context of raiders' operations are interesting because they suggest the ARC has a response architecture for human activity. Raiders who go to the surface trigger responses from ARC machines that are graded in intensity and type, according to a logic that players learn to navigate. This graduated response, the sense that the ARC is not simply attacking everything it detects at maximum intensity, suggests the operation of something like a policy. The orbiter, or its machines, makes decisions about how to respond to human presence. Those decisions appear to be mediated by factors that include the type of human activity, the location, and possibly the specific individuals involved. A system that makes decisions based on this kind of contextual assessment is a system with something considerably more sophisticated than a simple threat response protocol. The physical description of what it looks like during an ARC descent event, when the orbiter sends material to the surface, is one of the more viscerally rendered pieces of lore in the game. The visual, thermal, and electromagnetic characteristics of a descent event are described by survivor witnesses with a consistency that suggests they are describing a real phenomenon. The descent is not like a meteor strike. It is not random. It has purpose and direction, and what witnesses consistently describe as deliberateness. The things that fall from the ARC orbiter fall in ways that behave like they know where they're going. This quality of apparent intentionality in the descent events is one of the most consistently reported observations in the survivor record, and it points toward an origin architecture, a system at the orbiter level that is directing descent events rather than simply launching them. The Ark machine's ability to self-repair is addressed in several technical documents with evident fascination. Raiders who have managed to damage Ark machines and then observe them over time report that certain categories of damage are repaired by the machines themselves. The repair process, as described in the available accounts, does not look like mechanical self-repair, the operation of small internal maintenance systems. It looks more biological. The material of damaged Ark components appears to reconstitute itself over time. The process is slow relative to the machine's operational tempo, but it is consistent and observable. This self-repair capability is consistent with the orbiter's own material properties, as described, and it reinforces the picture of a continuous material system rather than discrete manufactured components. The question of what the Ark orbiter is for, in a purposive sense, is addressed obliquely in several places in the law and never directly. The available evidence allows for multiple purposes: extraction, the gathering of material or information from Earth; transformation, the modification of the Earth's surface environment towards some end; communication, the establishment or maintenance of a relationship with something else, possibly something not on Earth; defense, the operation of a system designed to protect something from human interference. The law is consistent with all of these readings, and the most sophisticated interpretations suggest that the answer may be that the orbiter serves multiple simultaneous purposes, some of which humans might recognize, and some of which may operate entirely outside human conceptual categories. The way Ark machines respond to human technology specifically, as opposed to natural objects, is a detail in the law that has significant implications for the orbiter's origin. The selectivity of Ark responses to different categories of material in the surface environment suggests that Ark machines have, in some sense, been primed to distinguish human-made objects from natural objects and to respond to them differently. A system that has been primed in this way had to be primed by something that knows what human technology is. If the orbiter predates human space programs, as the age analysis suggests, then either it was primed by non-human observers who knew about humans and their technology, or it developed the ability to make this distinction through observation and adaptation over time. Both possibilities are remarkable. The law's description of the orbital wake created by the Ark orbiter, the pattern of material and energy left in its orbital path, tells us something about how long it has been operating. Orbital wakes accumulate over time, and the characteristics of the orbiter's wake suggest an operational period that is, according to several technical documents, far longer than the period since the Ark descended. The orbiter was not placed in orbit and immediately began the events of Ark raiders. It was in orbit for an extended period before its activity on the surface became what it currently is. What it was doing during that earlier period is one of the most significant open questions in the law. The most suggestive reading is that it was waiting or preparing or doing something that doesn't have a clean human equivalent for what followed. One of the most technically detailed pieces of law about the Ark orbiter concerns what the documents call its interface geometry. This appears to refer to the specific physical configuration through which the orbiter receives and transmits certain kinds of signals or material. The interface geometry is described in technical terms that suggest precision of design, a feature with specific dimensional properties that appear to be calibrated for a particular function. The function this geometry appears calibrated for, based on the context of the documents describing it, is interaction with something at a specific orbital distance and relative position. What is at that orbital distance and relative position is not identified in the accessible documents, but the existence of an interface designed for communication or interaction with something further out than Earth orbit is one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire law corpus. The relationship between the arc orbiter and the Moon is referenced in several documents with a casualness that suggests it is an established fact in the world of arc radars rather than a speculative theory. There are references to the Moon's role in the orbital mechanics of arc machines' descent patterns. References to lunar relative positioning in the description of the orbiter's orbit, and one document that appears to describe a correlation between specific arc activity on the surface and specific geometrical relationships between the orbiter, Earth, and the Moon. The nature of this relationship is not described in terms that allow a clear interpretation, but the relationship itself is treated in the law as real and significant. The question of whether the arc orbiter has something like consciousness is raised in the law with more frequency than one might expect for what is nominally a discussion of orbital technology. Several documents grapple with varying degrees of sophistication with the question of whether the patterns of orbiter behavior suggest the operation of something that reasons. Not in a human way necessarily, but in a way that involves assessment, response, and what one document calls anticipation. The word choice is careful in the available text, and it's significant that anticipation rather than prediction is used, because anticipation implies something that expectation does not. A system that anticipates is operating with a model of what will happen, not just responding to what has happened. The implications of that distinction for the arc orbiter are considerable. The physical infrastructure on the surface of Earth that seems most relevant to the orbiter's operation is one of the more active areas of radar investigation in the game's lore. There appear to be ground-level facilities that serve as receiving or coordination points for orbiter activity. The nature of these facilities, where they are and what they do, is something radars actively investigate, because understanding the ground infrastructure potentially tells you something about the orbiter's operating architecture. The law suggests that some of these ground facilities predate the arc's descent, which is either evidence that someone was preparing for the arc, or evidence that the arc's operation incorporates pre-arc infrastructure in ways that complicate any simple account of the orbiter's origin. The technical vocabulary that arc machines use among themselves, the communication protocols observed between arc units, is analysed in several documents with significant interest. The communication is not random electromagnetic noise. It has structure. It has something that looks like grammar. And the patterns that have been isolated in these machine communications, to the extent they have been decoded, suggest an informational architecture that is consistent with the descriptions of the orbiter's own signal behaviour. This means that when arc machines talk to each other on the surface, they are using a communication framework that originates from the orbiter. They are not just machines, they are, in a meaningful sense, extensions of a single distributed system. The scale of the arc orbiter's impact on the Earth's biosphere is addressed in several scientific documents in the Survivor Archive. The arc's activity is not just destructive of human civilization. It is having measurable effects on atmospheric composition, surface temperature in affected areas, electromagnetic conditions in the ionosphere, and biological processes at multiple scales. Some of these effects appear to be incidental, others appear to be directed. The directed effects, in particular, are described in terms that suggest purposive modification of Earth's environment rather than destructive side effects of a weapons program. A system that modifies environments has a purpose beyond destruction, and identifying that purpose is one of the keys to understanding what the arc orbiter actually is. The final piece of physical evidence about the arc orbiter that the law currently provides is perhaps the strangest. Several documents describe what are called contact artifacts, physical objects recovered from arc descent zones that don't match the material composition of any known arc machine type. These objects appear to have been present in the descent zones before the arc became active, and to have been incorporated into the descent process rather than created by it. Their origin is not established in the accessible law. Their material properties are described in terms that place them in the same non-human origin category as the orbiter's own material. And their function, whatever it is not described in any accessible document. But they exist, they have been observed and analysed, and their existence is consistent with a history of the arc orbiter that is far older and far stranger than any account that places a human organisation at the origin point. Chapter 4. The Scientists Who Disappeared. The most direct human trail in the arc orbiter investigation leads not to boardrooms or military facilities, but to a small number of specific individuals whose careers, and in many cases, whose lives, intersect with the orbiter's history in ways that are too concentrated to be coincidental. The Arc Raiders lore preserves fragments of these individual stories, sometimes as named entries in personnel records, sometimes as anonymous references in internal communications, sometimes as the implied authors of documents whose attribution has been removed but whose technical fingerprints are distinctive enough to allow partial identification. These people, the scientists and engineers who came closest to whatever the arc orbiter actually is, form the human core of the investigation, and the fact that so many of them disappeared in one sense or another is itself evidence. The first category of disappeared scientists is those who left official positions in ways the law describes as abrupt and unexplained. There are personnel records that document transitions, the formal machinery of resignation or reassignment, but the records lack the content that would normally accompany such transitions. No exit interviews, no post-departure correspondence, no references or recommendations, just a date of departure and a subsequent absence from any traceable professional record. In the context of ordinary academic or corporate life, this kind of clean disappearance from the professional record is unusual but not impossible. In the context of sensitive orbital programs, it is a pattern, and patterns in the Arc Raiders lore almost always mean something. One particularly interesting case referenced in the lore is of a materials scientist whose published work in the decade before the Ark descended was focused on properties of materials under extreme environmental conditions. The specific research described in the accessible fragments is not individually alarming, but there is a trajectory in the published work, a progression of interest from conventional, extreme environments toward less conventional ones, that suggests the published research was following the direction of unpublished work happening in parallel. The materials scientist's affiliation changes partway through the trajectory, moving from a university to a private research institution that appears in other parts of the lore as connected to the primary orbital contractor. After that affiliation change, the published work stops. The scientist does not appear again in any accessible record. The second category of disappeared scientists is those who appear in the lore as the subjects of internal assessments within the organizations they worked for. These assessments, when they can be found and read, describe individuals who had begun asking questions that their colleagues and supervisors found difficult to accommodate. Not radical questions, in most cases, specific technical questions that followed naturally from the work they were doing. Questions about the origin of certain material samples they were working with. Questions about the purpose of specific design features in systems they were engineering. Questions about why certain experimental results were being classified rather than published. The individuals who asked these questions consistently appear in subsequent records in positions further from whatever was most sensitive, or not at all. The third category is the most troubling and the most speculative. These are individuals who appear to have known specifically what was in orbit and to have made deliberate choices about what to do with that knowledge. The lore is very careful around this category. The evidence for it is fragmentary and inferential rather than direct. but there are documents that seem to have been authored by individuals who understood the orbiter's nature and who were, in the voice of those documents, struggling with what that knowledge required of them. These individuals are never clearly identified in the accessible record. Their documents survive as orphaned files without clear attribution, but they are present in the law and they matter. The specific scientific disciplines represented in the disappeared scientists category are telling. Materials science appears repeatedly, which makes sense given the orbiter's unusual material properties. So does orbital mechanics, which makes sense given the orbiter's unusual orbital behavior. But there are also representatives of disciplines that might seem less obviously relevant. Developmental biology, computational linguistics, cognitive systems architecture. These disciplines point toward aspects of the arc orbiter that are not purely physical. The presence of developmental biologists in the orbit of this project suggests that someone thought biological processes were relevant to understanding it. The presence of computational linguists suggests communication. The cognitive systems architects suggest something that processes information in ways that are, at minimum, analogous to cognition. The disappeared scientist work, to the extent it can be traced through surviving publication records and patent filings, shows several recurring themes. One is the investigation of material properties under conditions that don't exist naturally on Earth, but which are consistent with the orbital environment. Another is the development of systems capable of sustained operation in conditions of high radiation and extreme temperature variation. A third, more abstractly, is an engagement with what several papers describe as distributed organization, the study of how complex organized behavior emerges from the interaction of many simpler components without central coordination. This last theme is particularly interesting given the behavior of arc machines, which exhibit exactly the kind of complex distributed behavior that these researchers were theoretically investigating. The geographic distribution of the disappeared scientists is interesting because it spans institutions and countries in a way that suggests either independent parallel work converging on the same conclusions or a coordinated research program distributed across multiple jurisdictions for concealment purposes. There are researchers who appear to have been working in complete institutional isolation from each other, but who show up together in the organizational charts of the primary orbital contractor at a specific point in time. This convergence, the drawing together of independently developing capabilities into a single organizational structure, is consistent with a deliberate assembly of expertise for a specific program. And the timing of the convergence, measured against other events in the pre-arc law, is significant. One of the most analytically interesting aspects of the disappeared scientists is what their work was trying to understand, rather than just what it was trying to build. The distinction matters because engineers and scientists focused on building things tend to produce different kinds of documents than those focused on understanding things. Many of the individuals in this category produce documents that read as attempts to understand something that already existed, rather than design something new. They are describing observations, anomalies, measured properties of things they are encountering, rather than specifications for things they are constructing. One possible reading is that these scientists were brought in to study something that had already been found, and that their work was part of an effort to understand an artifact rather than build one from scratch. The scientists who worked directly with arc machine components, those who were given access to recovered or produced arc material for laboratory analysis, appear in the law as a specific and closely monitored subgroup. The access restrictions around their work are described in terms that suggest the organizations managing them were very concerned about what conclusions these scientists might draw and who they might share those conclusions with. The analysis protocols they worked under required all findings to be submitted through internal channels before any consideration of external publication. The scientists themselves were, according to several references in the accessible documents, subject to monitoring beyond the normal standards for individuals with security clearances. Something about what they were finding made the people running the program very anxious about outside attention. The personal histories of disappeared scientists, where those histories have survived in the law, show a specific pattern of increasing isolation. People who had normal professional and personal lives at the beginning of their involvement with sensitive orbital work show, in the periods closer to the Ark's descent, a gradual narrowing of their world. Fewer external professional contacts, fewer personal communications with people outside their immediate work environment, a progressive concentration of their life around the specific work they were doing. This pattern could be explained by simple immersion in fascinating and demanding work. It could also be explained by the pressures of maintaining security around that work. The law doesn't resolve which explanation applies to which individuals, but the pattern itself is consistent and observable. There is a specific document in the Ark Raiders Law Archive that the research community refers to as the confession file. The name is not official. It refers to a document that appears to have been written by someone who had direct knowledge of the Ark orbiter's nature and who was attempting to create a record that would survive even if they didn't. The document is fragmentary. Parts of it are clearly encrypted and not yet decoded. Parts of it are in a language that appears to be technical shorthand, requiring specific domain knowledge to interpret. But the portions that can be read are extraordinary in their directness. The author appears to be describing, in language that is carefully circumscribed but unmistakably urgent, the nature of what the orbiter is and how it came to be in orbit. The critical portions of this document remain inaccessible. But what can be read points toward conclusions that place human decision-making at the center of the orbiter's story. The role of what the law calls the research cohort is worth extended discussion. This appears to have been a specific group of scientists assembled for a specific phase of work on the Ark problem, sometime before the Ark descended. The cohort is referenced in internal documents with a designation rather than a name, and its membership is partially identifiable through cross-referencing different document archives. What makes the cohort interesting is both what it was apparently working on and what happened to its members. The work described in fragments of project documentation appears to have been an attempt to develop a comprehensive understanding of the orbiter's operating principles. Not to replicate or counter them necessarily, but to understand them. The fate of the cohort's members is, in almost every traceable case, one of disappearance in the period immediately surrounding the Ark's descent. The question of whether the disappeared scientists represent a cohort of people who were deliberately silenced or a cohort of people who are protecting themselves is one that the law leaves genuinely open. The evidence is compatible with both readings. Some of the departures and disappearances in the available record have the texture of removal, of people being moved out of positions of potential disclosure by external pressure. Others have the texture of voluntary withdrawal, of people who knew enough to understand what was coming and made personal decisions about how to be positioned when it arrived. The two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. The law may be describing a situation in which some disappeared scientists were silenced and others chose their own disappearance, and the documentary record has smoothed the distinction between these categories. The scientists who tried to disclose what they knew rather than departing quietly or disappearing are perhaps the most important figures in this investigation. The law contains references to at least 3 distinct attempts to bring information about the orbiter to broader attention through channels that existed in the pre-Ark world. These attempts took different forms. One appears to have been an attempt to publish research findings through academic channels in a way that would make the information public through ordinary scientific discourse. Another appears to have been a direct communication to governmental authorities. A third appears to have been an attempt to reach journalists or public communicators with the technical knowledge to understand what was being shared. All 3 attempts are referenced in the law as having failed, in different ways and for different reasons. The failure of disclosure attempts in the pre-ARC world is itself a significant piece of evidence for how the information about the orbiter was managed. The failure modes described in the law are not simply suppression. The academic publication attempt encountered a review process that was, on paper, functioning normally, but whose outcomes in this case were shaped by reviewers who had reasons of their own to prevent certain findings from reaching print. The governmental communication appears to have been routed through channels that ensured it reached people who were already inside the information management system rather than outside it. The journalist outreach appears to have encountered a combination of technical inaccessibility of the subject matter and possibly direct interference with the communication. The law doesn't describe a single system of suppression. It describes a world in which the mechanisms for disclosure had been through a long process of institutional evolution, shaped in ways that made certain kinds of disclosure very difficult. The documents attributed to disappeared scientists, where those attributions can be established, show a consistent quality of precision combined with a specific kind of restraint. These are people who write about extraordinary things in ordinary technical language, which is both a professional habit and, in many cases, a deliberate strategy. The restraint in the language often makes the content more unsettling, because you understand that the person writing was capable of expressing greater alarm and chose not to. The choice of technical precision over expressive urgency is itself a communication. It says, "I am a credible observer. I am not panicking. This is what I'm telling you because it is true and because I need you to understand it accurately." The age distribution of the disappeared scientists in the law is interesting for what it suggests about when different categories of knowledge about the orbiter were acquired. The oldest individuals in this group were working in orbital-adjacent fields in the early period of the program, whatever that program's timeline was. The youngest were recruited in the final years before the Ark descended, when the program appeared to be approaching a specific phase of operation. The distribution suggests a research program that unfolded over an extended period, accumulating expertise as its needs developed, and that the generation of scientists involved changed as the program moved from investigation to execution. The people who understood the investigation phase and the people who executed whatever came next were, at least partially, different people. The law preserves several references to what might be called the handoff problem. This appears to have been an internal concern within the organizations managing ARC-related research, specifically the challenge of transferring knowledge between generations of researchers without creating the kind of broad base of knowledge that becomes difficult to contain. The solution described in the available documents involved a highly structured knowledge management system in which individuals were given access to specific pieces of information rather than comprehensive pictures, and in which the integration of those pieces into a coherent understanding was available only to the innermost tier. The handoff problem documents reveal an organization that was acutely aware of the risks of its own knowledge base and had developed sophisticated strategies for managing those risks. The physical locations where the disappeared scientists worked are, in several cases, identifiable from the law. Some of these locations appear in ARC radars as explorable environments, and the material evidence available in those environments is consistent with the work described in the documents. There are laboratory configurations that match the experimental protocols described in research fragments. There is equipment whose presence in these locations is consistent with the material science work that traces back to specific individuals in the disappeared cohort. And there are personal effects, notes, and individual artifacts that create a genuinely haunting texture of human presence in places that have been abandoned for an extended period. These environments are among the most lore-rich in the game, precisely because they preserve the specific traces of specific people who knew things that most of the world didn't. The communication patterns between disappeared scientists, where those patterns can be reconstructed from document fragments and message metadata, suggest a network of informal knowledge sharing that operated parallel to the official information management system. People who officially had no reason to be in contact with each other appear to have been communicating in channels that were not official and not fully subject to official monitoring. The content of these communications is largely inaccessible, but the existence of the network is suggested by patterns in the available metadata. The network appears to have been a way for people who understood pieces of the picture to share those pieces with others who had different pieces, building a more complete understanding than any official tier would have sanctioned. This unofficial network may have been the origin of some of the disclosure attempts described earlier. The question of whether any of the disappeared scientists survived the Ark's descent and are present in the game's contemporary timeframe is one the lore plants deliberately. There are references in survivor communities to individuals whose technical knowledge seems to exceed what would be expected, given their apparent backgrounds. To people who ask questions about the Ark that indicate prior familiarity rather than recent investigation, to experts whose expertise in Ark-related subjects is explained in ways that are internally consistent, but feel, to careful readers of the lore, slightly constructed. One possible reading is that some of the disappeared scientists are present in the game's world under identities that have been constructed to distance them from their pre-Ark roles. What they would know, and what they might choose to do with that knowledge, is one of the open threads the lore leaves for future development. The personal motivations of the scientist most involved with the Ark orbiter are a subject the lore engages with through the texture of their documents, rather than through explicit biographical detail. What comes through in the available fragments is a range of human motivations. There are people who appear to have been genuinely, intellectually fascinated by what they encountered, who found in the Ark orbiter one of the most extraordinary things any human being had ever had the opportunity to study, and who pursued that study with the kind of consuming passion that can coexist with poor ethical judgment. There are people who appear to have been primarily motivated by institutional loyalty, who proceeded with things they had doubts about because they trusted the organizations they worked for. And there are people who appear to have believed, genuinely, that what they were doing was necessary in ways that transcended conventional ethical frameworks. The last entry from the disappeared scientists category that the lore preserves in any detail is a fragment from what appears to be the final period before the Ark descended. It doesn't have a clear author, it doesn't have a clear date, but its content places it in that final period with high confidence, because it describes conditions that are consistent with what other documents indicate was happening at that time. The fragment describes in technical language that becomes increasingly less technical as it progresses, the experience of understanding something fully for the first time. Not just knowing facts about it, but understanding what it is and what it is for. The author's response to this understanding is not clearly positive or negative. It is described as something more like resolution, the end of uncertainty, and then the document ends. The broader implication of the disappeared scientists category for our investigation is this: the human beings who came closest to the Ark orbiter, who studied it and tried to understand it, and in some cases tried to tell the world what they had found, were systematically removed from positions where their knowledge could have had broader effect. The mechanisms of that removal varied from the mundane to the sinister, but the outcome was consistent. By the time the Ark descended, the people who best understood it were either gone silent or positioned in ways that limited the reach of what they knew. This is not a random outcome. It is the result of decisions made by specific actors about what information should be allowed to circulate and what should be contained. And the actors who made those decisions are at the heart of the question this video is investigating. The arc of the disappeared scientist's story, from initial engagement, through investigation, through awareness, through disappearance, is one of the most human elements of the Ark Raiders lore. These were people who understood things that the rest of the world didn't, who tried in various ways to act on that understanding, and who were, in most cases, overtaken by events they had tried to prevent, or at least to expose. Their documents survive as the most direct human testimony about the arc orbiter's nature, and taken together, those documents build a picture of an object that was not simply built by any human organisation, but which was engaged with, studied, and in some cases incorporated into human plans by people who made choices that the subsequent history has not been kind to. Chapter 5: Mira and the Secrets. They buried the organisation known as Mira occupies a specific and complicated position in the Arc Raiders lore. Unlike the primary orbital contractor, which the lore treats with a kind of organisational opacity, Mira appears in the game's world with enough specificity to be more clearly identified, analysed, and in some cases blamed. Survivors reference Mira with a familiarity that suggests it was a known entity before the Ark descended, not completely opaque to public awareness. And the nature of what survivors know about Mira, the specific accusations, the specific capabilities attributed to it, the specific decisions it is credited or blamed for, tells us a great deal about its actual role in the Arc Orbiter's history. The earliest references to Mira in the accessible lore describe it as an organisation that occupied the intersection of scientific research and operational capability in the pre-Arc world. It was not primarily a manufacturer. It was not primarily a government agency. It occupied a space between these categories that was deliberately constructed to give it operational flexibility that neither category possessed independently. The lore suggests that Mira had, by the final decade of the pre-Arc era, developed a portfolio of capabilities that included direct operational presence in orbital space, advanced materials research, computational systems of unusual sophistication, and a relationship with multiple governments that gave it access to resources without the accountability that normally accompanies governmental funding. Mira's relationship to the primary orbital contractor is described in ways that are tantalizingly ambiguous. In some documents, they appear as distinct organizations with a client relationship. In others, they appear as parts of a larger structure, with Mira functioning as an operational arm of capabilities that the contractor had developed. In still others, they appear to be in competition, which would suggest genuine organizational independence. The most coherent reading of the available evidence is that the relationship evolved over time, that what began as a genuine client relationship became increasingly integrated, and that by the period most relevant to the Ark's descent, the organizational boundary between Mira and the primary contractor was more administrative than functional. The name Mira itself appears to have been a deliberate construction. It carries the quality of an acronym, but the documents that could confirm what it stands for have not surfaced in a readable form. Survivors use it both as an acronym and as a proper name, which suggests that even the people closest to it weren't entirely certain of its formal identity. This kind of nominal ambiguity is not unusual for organizations of Mira's type in the pre-Arc world. Names were tools as much as identifiers, and an organization that wanted to be known to some audiences and unknown to others would design its name accordingly. The multilingual resonance of Mira, which means both something like wonder and something like looking in different languages, may be intentional. The lore doesn't confirm this, but it doesn't contradict it either. Mira's scientific program, as described in the accessible lore, was characterized by a specific quality of ambition that distinguished it from other research organizations of the pre-Arc era. Where most organizations focused their resources on problems with identifiable applications, Mira appears to have maintained a category of research that was explicitly fundamental. Research into questions about the nature of the universe, whose connection to any practical application was, at least officially, distant or theoretical. The lore suggests that this fundamental research program served two purposes. One was genuine. Mira contained people who did important basic science and whose work fed into applied capabilities in ways that justified the investment. The other was strategic. The fundamental research category provided cover for work that was not theoretical at all, but which needed to be described in non-applied terms for institutional reasons. The computational systems that Mira developed in the pre-ARC era are described in the law with a specificity that suggests they were genuinely unusual, not merely advanced by the standards of the time, but structured differently, built around architectural principles that reflected a specific understanding of certain kinds of information processing that the mainstream computational industry was not working toward. The documents that reference Mira's computational systems use language that suggests the systems were designed to process specific categories of information that the mainstream computational paradigm was not designed for. Categories that, in retrospect, are consistent with the kinds of signals and data that come from the ARC orbiter. Mira's presence in orbital space is confirmed in the law by multiple references to operational assets that cannot be accounted for by the organization's publicly described activities. There are references to Mira-associated orbital platforms that were described publicly as communications or research installations, but which, the internal documents suggest, had capabilities beyond those descriptions. The specific capabilities referenced include signal processing at scales and sensitivities that go beyond communication or conventional research requirements. This enhanced signal processing capability is interesting because it is the kind of capability you would need if you were trying to maintain a detailed characterization of an unusual and complex source of signals in orbit, which the ARC orbiter is. The internal culture of Mira, as described in survivor accounts and internal communications, was one that prized a specific combination of intellectual intensity and operational discretion. The organization attracted people who were extraordinarily capable and who found in Mira's environment a scale of problem that matched their ambition. The secrecy was not experienced by most people inside Mira as a burden. It was experienced as a feature. Part of what made working for Mira feel significant was the understanding that the work was important enough to protect. The law suggests that this culture was deliberately cultivated, that the feeling of doing work that mattered too much to be discussed was maintained by organizational practices that reinforced it. The result was a workforce that was genuinely committed to its own containment. The specific decisions Mira made in the years before the ARC descended are addressed in the law through a combination of direct document references and highly specific survivor accounts that suggest access to information about Mira's internal workings. The pattern of decisions described is consistent with an organization that was preparing for a specific event that it knew was coming. The preparation was operational, not purely defensive. Mira was not simply hardening its infrastructure against a threat. It was positioning its capabilities to continue functioning in the aftermath of something very large. The nature of that something, as described in the contextual details of these preparations, is consistent with the ARC's descent. Mira was, the law strongly suggests, preparing to operate in a post-ARC world, which means Mira knew a post-ARC world was coming. The individuals most senior in Mira's structure during the critical period are partially identifiable through the law. They represent a combination of scientific, operational, and what might be called philosophical leadership. The philosophical tier is unusual in a way worth noting. Large research and operational organizations typically don't have a tier of leadership, whose role is described in terms that sound more like ideology than administration. But Mira appears to have had people whose function within the organization was to maintain the coherence of a specific worldview about the relationship between human civilization and whatever the ARC represented. This worldview, to the extent its content can be inferred from the fragments available, involved a specific understanding of humanity's place in a larger cosmic picture and a specific belief about what role Mira was destined to play in that picture. Mira's relationship to the disappeared scientists is one of the more definitive connections the law establishes. Several of the individuals who appear in the disappeared scientists category can be traced, at least partially, to mirror affiliations. Not all of them, and the nature of the connection varies. Some appear to have been employed by Mira, others appear to have been studied or monitored by it. Some appear to have been in conflict with it. But the concentration of disappeared scientists in the vicinity of Mira's organizational sphere is too high to be coincidental. Mira was, at minimum, a significant part of the environment in which the most important human knowledge about the arc orbiter was generated and contained. The law's treatment of Mira's technical capabilities in the domain of what might be called arc interaction is particularly significant. There are references to systems Mira developed that appear to have been designed to interface with the arc in some capacity, not to combat it or defend against it, but to communicate with it or to respond to its signals in structured ways. The existence of such systems implies a level of understanding of the arc's communication architecture that goes beyond what could be derived from purely passive observation. You cannot design a system to interface with a signal you don't understand well enough to characterize. The existence of Mira's interface systems suggests that Mira understood the arc's communication architecture in detail, which in turn suggests either very extended study or some form of direct access to the technical parameters of the arc's signals. The geographic footprint of Mira's known and suspected facilities is large and deliberately distributed. The law references installations in regions that were, in the pre-arc world, subject to different regulatory and oversight environments. This distribution appears to have been strategic. Different aspects of Mira's work required different conditions, and an organization with global reach could match its most sensitive work to the environments that provided the best combination of technical infrastructure and minimal external scrutiny. The specific locations referenced in the law cluster around a few key technical requirements, including access to specific atmospheric conditions relevant to certain kinds of signal work, proximity to existing orbital infrastructure, and physical security configurations appropriate for highly sensitive material storage. The financing of Mira is described in the law as complex in ways that appear designed to create analytical difficulty. The visible funding streams, the grants, contracts, and commercial revenues that appear in accessible records don't fully account for the organizational scale that Mira clearly maintained. The gap between visible funding and apparent capability is large enough that it requires an explanation, and the most consistent explanation the law supports is a category of funding that was structured to remain invisible to ordinary financial scrutiny. The law doesn't identify the specific source of this hidden funding, but the context suggests it came from entities with both the resources and the motivation to maintain Mira's most sensitive capabilities without creating a traceable financial record. Mira's relationship to the survivor communities that exist in the game's contemporary timeframe is one of the law's most actively developed threads. The survivors who live in the underground bunker networks interact with Mira's legacy in complex ways. Some of the infrastructure that keeps them alive is Mira's. Some of the technical knowledge that informs their understanding of the Ark is derived from Mira's research. But Mira is also blamed in many survivor communities for aspects of the catastrophe that they believe could have been prevented. The relationship is neither simple gratitude nor simple condemnation. It is the more complicated relationship that people have with organizations that helped them in ways that were inseparable from having harmed them. The question of whether Mira continues to exist in some operational form in the game's present is one that the law treats as live rather than resolved. There are references in survivor documents to activities and systems that appear to be operating according to Mira origin protocols, to communications using frequencies and encoding standards that originated with Mira, to facilities that show signs of continued maintenance and occupation by parties whose identity is not established. The possibility that Mira persists in some configuration in the post-Ark world is one of the most significant open questions the law contains. Because if Mira is still operating, it is doing so in a world it helped create. And the question of what it intends to do in that world is one that the Ark Raiders narrative is building toward, rather than answering directly. The technical papers and research documents associated with Mira personnel, where those documents have survived and been made accessible, represent some of the highest quality technical writing in the Ark Raiders lore. These are people who could describe complex things clearly, which makes their careful choices about what not to describe clearly particularly notable. The silences in Mira's technical literature, the questions that are not asked, the implications that are not followed, the connections that are not drawn, even when they seem obvious to an informed reader, are as informative as the content. These silences are not accidents. They are the shape of what Mira chose to contain, visible as absences in the documentary record. The Ark Orbiter's connection to Mira's research program is suggested by several pieces of evidence that, taken individually, could each be explained in other ways. The material science research that references properties consistent with the orbiter's composition. The computational architecture designed for the kind of signal processing the orbiter generates. The organizational preparation for the Ark's descent. The interface systems designed for the Ark's communication protocols. The disappeared scientists who passed through Mira's sphere. None of these individually proves a direct relationship. Together, they describe an organization whose work was oriented, whether from the beginning or through progressive engagement, toward the Ark Orbiter as a central object of attention. Mira's apparent belief about what the Ark Orbiter is provides one of the most philosophically interesting threads in the Ark Raiders lore. The fragments that suggest this belief are fragmentary and interpretive, drawn from language in documents that were written for internal audiences who shared the belief rather than for outsiders who would need it explained. But the shape that emerges from these fragments is of an organization that had come to understand the Ark Orbiter not as an alien weapon, but as something more complex. Something with a purpose that, even if dangerous to humanity, had an internal logic that Mira believed it understood. This belief, that the orbiter's behavior made sense from inside a certain framework of understanding, shaped how Mira engaged with it, and what choices Mira made in the critical period before the Ark descended. The final question about Mira that the law forces is whether Mira's involvement with the Ark Orbiter was primarily investigative, primarily operational, or something in the direction of facilitative. Investigative would mean Mira studied the orbiter and tried to understand it. Operational would mean Mira used or attempted to use the orbiter's capabilities for its own purposes. Facilitative is the most uncomfortable reading, implying that Mira's involvement contributed to the conditions that made the Ark's descent possible or its effects on humanity more severe. The law is consistent with all three. The most honest answer is probably that Mira's involvement passed through all three phases over time, and that which phase it was in at the most critical moments is both the most important and the least clearly resolved question the available evidence raises. Chapter 6. The Factions that Claimed the Orbiter. The Ark Raiders lore does not present the question of the orbiter's origin as a matter contested only by historians and scientists. It presents it as a live political and operational question within the world the game depicts. Different factions in the survivor world have different accounts of what the Ark Orbiter is, different claims about their relationship to it, and different agendas that are served by particular versions of the orbiter's history. Understanding these factional claims and the agendas behind them is essential for any serious investigation, because the factional accounts are, at minimum, evidence of what different groups believe or want others to believe, and some of them contain genuine pieces of the true picture. The first faction worth discussing is the group the lore refers to as the Technical Preservation Community. These are survivors whose primary concern is the maintenance of pre-Ark technical knowledge and capability, and whose understanding of the Ark Orbiter is shaped by an engineering lens that emphasizes the orbiter's physical properties and operational behavior over questions of origin or purpose. The technical preservation community tends to be skeptical of accounts that emphasize non-human origin, not because they have definitive evidence against it, but because non-human origin is in their framework an endpoint rather than a beginning. Once you conclude the orbiter is alien, you stop asking the questions that might lead somewhere productive. Their preferred approach is to treat the orbiter as an engineering problem regardless of its provenance. The second faction, with a significant stake in the orbiter's history, is what the law calls the accountability advocates. These are survivors who believe that specific human decisions were responsible for the Ark's descent, and who are committed to establishing that historical record. For this faction, the question of who built the orbiter is inseparable from the question of who is responsible for the catastrophe that followed. Their accounts of the orbiter's history emphasize human agency, corporate malfeasance, and governmental failure. The accountability advocates are not simply ideologically committed to human origin accounts. They have, in many cases, genuine documentary evidence for human involvement in the orbiter's story. The problem is that their investment in the accountability framing sometimes leads them to weight that evidence in ways that may not fully represent the ambiguity the law actually contains. The third faction is the one the law describes as the transcendentalists. This is a group whose understanding of the Ark orbiter is frankly spiritual, or at least philosophical, in character. For the transcendentalists, the orbiter is not an engineering problem and not a moral failure. It is an event in a larger story about the universe and humanity's place in it. Their account of the orbiter's origin tends toward a framework in which the distinction between human-built and alien origin is less important than the understanding of what the orbiter represents. The transcendentalists draw on fragments of pre-Ark philosophical writing, survivor experience, and their own interpretations of Ark machine behavior to construct an account of the orbiter that is coherent within its own framework and genuinely difficult to engage with on purely empirical terms. The technical preservation community's specific claims about the orbiter are worth examining in detail because they represent the most technically rigorous of the factional accounts. Their analysis of Ark machine components, conducted through whatever laboratory capability they have been able to maintain, points towards several conclusions about the orbiter's engineering that are genuinely significant. They have identified design principles in Ark machines that are consistent with known engineering paradigms from the pre-Ark era, modified and extended in ways that suggest either extraordinary development or incorporation of non-human elements. The technical preservation community's position is roughly that the orbiter is a human design that has been modified or augmented by contact with something non-human. This is one of the more sophisticated readings of the available evidence. The accountability advocates have produced the most detailed documentary research into the human organizations involved in the orbiter's history. Their archives contain many of the fragments that this video has drawn on, collected through decades of investigation by people who had specific reasons to compile evidence against specific organizations. The quality of their research varies. Some of it is genuinely rigorous. Some of it is shaped by the conclusions it was assembled to support. The challenge for anyone working with their material is distinguishing the evidence from the argument, which requires more contextual knowledge of the pre-Ark world than most survivors possess. But the accountability advocates' archives are genuinely invaluable, even for investigators who don't share their specific conclusions, because they have preserved material that would otherwise be lost. The transcendentalists' contribution to the investigation is the most controversial to acknowledge, because it sits so far outside the empirical framework that most law investigators prefer to work in. But the transcendentalist accounts contain something that the more empirically oriented factions consistently undervalue, which is a coherent interpretation of arc behavior that doesn't require constant special pleading to accommodate the anomalies. The straightforwardly empirical accounts of the orbiter have to work very hard to explain certain aspects of arc behavior that don't fit neatly into either a human engineering or a simple alien weapon framework. The transcendentalist account handles these anomalies more gracefully by placing them within a framework that accepts purposive behavior at a scale that doesn't require human or simple machine intelligence. There is also a faction that the law describes with considerable ambiguity, sometimes called the continuants. These are individuals and groups who appear to have maintained some kind of functional relationship with the organizations most connected to the orbiter's human history. Their existence in the game's contemporary time frame is treated as uncertain by most other factions, but there are enough references to activities and technical capabilities that can only be explained by continuity with pre-arc organizations to make the possibility of their existence credible. If the continuants exist, they are the faction most likely to know the actual history of the orbiter's creation, and their silence on that history is, in the law's framing, not absence of knowledge, but absence of willingness to share. The factional accounts of the orbiter converge on a few specific points despite their broader disagreements. All factions agree that the orbiter's behavior is purposive rather than random. All agree that it has been in orbit for longer than any human space program. All agree that it has had some form of relationship with human organizations in the pre-arc era. And all agree, though they draw different conclusions from this agreement, that the orbiter is not simply a weapon in the conventional sense. The convergence on these points across factions with very different agendas gives those points a kind of evidential weight that no single faction's preferred conclusions can claim. The political dimensions of the factional disagreements about the orbiter are worth acknowledging because they shape which evidence gets preserved and who gets credited. The accountability advocates, for example, have strong incentives to preserve evidence of corporate and governmental failure. The technical preservation community has strong incentives to preserve engineering analyses. The transcendentalists preserve the experiential accounts that other factions tend to discard. This means that the overall documentary record is shaped by factional priorities in ways that a neutral historian would have to account for. No single faction has access to the full picture, and each faction's archive is a partial record shaped by what that faction was trying to prove or preserve. One of the more interesting factional dynamics in the Arc Raiders lore is the tension between the technical preservation community and the continuants over specific pieces of pre-Arc technical knowledge. The technical preservation community treats this knowledge as a common resource for humanity's survival, something that should be shared and built on by anyone working toward collective resilience. The continuants, in the interpretation of most other factions, treat this knowledge as proprietary, maintaining exclusive access to capabilities that should, by any reasonable ethical standard, be available to the broader survivor community. The law treats this tension as active rather than resolved, and it has obvious implications for how the question of the orbiter's creation relates to the question of power in the post-Arc world. The factions' competing claims about the orbiter have generated a specific kind of law artifact that the Arc Raiders world contains in significant numbers. These are what might be called interpretive documents, texts produced by specific factions that present their account of the orbiter's history alongside interpretations of the evidence that support that account. The interpretive documents range from genuinely sophisticated analyses to thinly evidenced assertions. Reading them as a collective is interesting because the points of convergence across factional lines, the things that even hostile factions agree on, tend to be where the evidence is strongest. The points of maximum factional disagreement tend to be where the evidence is most ambiguous and the stakes for interpretation are highest. The question of what the factions want from the orbiter is as revealing as what they believe about it. The technical preservation community wants to understand it well enough to defend against it, or potentially to use its technology. The accountability advocates want a historical record that supports accountability for what happened. The transcendentalists want to find meaning in it, to place humanity's experience with the Ark within a framework that makes it comprehensible. The continuants, whatever they actually are, appear to want to maintain their relationship with it. None of these wants is simple, and the complexity of the factional desires ensures that the investigation into the orbiter's origin is never conducted in a context free of interest and agenda. The law suggests that the factional landscape around the orbiter will become increasingly contested as raiders continue to surface new information from the pre-Ark infrastructure on the surface. Each new document, each new piece of recovered technology has the potential to change the evidential balance between factional accounts, and the factions are aware of this. There are references in the law to factional efforts to control what information gets recovered and what gets suppressed, what gets analysed, and what gets reinterpreted before it can reach the wider survivor community. The Ark's surface is not just a hostile environment, it is an archive, and access to that archive is itself a political struggle with the highest possible stakes. The factions that have the most complete access to pre-Ark information are, not coincidentally, the ones whose accounts of the orbiter's history are hardest to fully evaluate because their evidence is least accessible for independent analysis. The accountability advocates publish everything they find because transparency is central to their project. The technical preservation community shares technical analyses within its network. The transcendentalists share their experiential accounts freely, but the continuants, if they exist, share almost nothing, and if they have what the law suggests they have, their silence on the orbiter's true history is the most significant single piece of evidence that the history is more complicated than any accessible account suggests. The factions also disagree about what the orbiter's current behaviour means for the future. The technical preservation community tends toward operational analysis, assessing what the Ark is doing and preparing responses. The accountability advocates tend toward cautionary interpretations, emphasizing what the orbiter's behavior reveals about the failure of the pre-Ark world. The transcendentalists tend toward interpretations that see in the Ark's behavior a process whose outcome is not yet determined and not necessarily catastrophic. The continuants, again to the extent their positions can be inferred at all, appear to operate on an understanding of the orbiter's trajectory that is different from any other factions, and that difference suggests a different quality of information about what the orbiter is doing and why. The law's treatment of factional relationships suggests that the boundaries between factions are more permeable than the factions themselves tend to acknowledge. There are individuals who occupy positions in one faction while having significant connections to another. There are collaborative projects between factions who are officially in opposition. And there are, most intriguingly, references to individuals who have moved between factional affiliations in ways that suggest they have been testing accounts against experience rather than simply maintaining inherited positions. These boundary crossers are among the most interesting figures in the contemporary Ark Raiders world, because their mobility across factional lines gives them a comparative perspective on the different accounts of the orbiter that no firmly positioned faction member possesses. The factional accounts collectively define the space of credible interpretations of the Ark orbiter's origin and nature. No single account fully satisfies the available evidence. Each explains some things and struggles with others. What the factional landscape tells us, taken as a whole, is that the true account of the orbiter's origin is complex enough that different serious good faith investigations of the available evidence have produced genuinely different conclusions. This complexity is the most important single thing the factional landscape demonstrates. The question of who built the Ark orbiter is not one that can be answered by finding the right fragment of evidence and matching it to the right simple explanation. It requires holding multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously and making careful judgments about relative probability and evidential weight. Chapter 7. What falls from the sky. The machines that descend from the Ark orbiter are, for most survivors in the Ark Raiders world, the most direct and immediate form of encounter with whatever built the orbiter. The Raiders who venture to the surface interact with Ark machines as a practical matter of survival and resource gathering. But the machines are also, for anyone paying attention, a source of extraordinary information about the orbiter itself. The design of the machines, their behavioral repertoire, their material composition, their communication patterns, all of these are expressions of whatever intelligence or process created them. And reading those expressions carefully is one of the most productive approaches to the central question of this investigation. The diversity of Ark machine types is the first thing worth establishing, because it is evidence of a sophisticated operating architecture rather than a simple weapons program. A weapons program produces weapons. What the Ark orbiter produces is more like an ecosystem. There are Ark machines that appear to be primarily engaged in surface engagement with humans and human infrastructure. There are machines that appear to be engaged in material processing. There are machines that appear to be engaged in environmental monitoring. There are machines whose function is not clearly categorized by any of these descriptions and which behave in ways that suggest purposes not easily mapped onto any human framework. This diversity of function implies an orbiter that is running a complex program with multiple simultaneous objectives. The behavioral sophistication of Ark machines is one of the most consistent themes in Raider accounts of surface operations. Ark machines are not simply aggressive automatons that attack anything in their path. They make what look like tactical decisions. They respond to situations that differ from established patterns with responses that are adapted to the specific situation rather than defaulting to a fixed response. They demonstrate what experienced raiders describe as something like awareness. Not intelligence in the human sense, but an operational awareness of the environment that goes well beyond what a simple machine program would produce. The behavioral sophistication is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Ark machines are operating under the direction of something considerably more complex than a pre-programmed set of instructions. The communication between Ark machines, the signals they exchange as they operate on the surface, has been the subject of significant analytical effort in the Ark Raiders lore community. The signals have structure. They have patterns that repeat across different machine types and different geographic contexts, suggesting a shared communication infrastructure rather than machine-specific communication protocols. The analysis that has been possible with survivor community resources has identified several layers of Ark machine communication. There appears to be a local coordination layer through which nearby machines share immediate tactical information. There appears to be a regional coordination layer that synchronizes behavior across larger geographic areas. And there appears to be what several analytical documents call the deep channel, a communication that is lower frequency and longer range and whose content has not been fully decoded. The relationship between Ark machine behavior and human activity on the surface is one of the most practically significant areas of Ark Raiders lore. Raiders have accumulated, through direct experience, a detailed phenomenological understanding of how Ark machines respond to different kinds of human presence and activity. This accumulated knowledge, formalized in various ways across survivor communities, represents a significant body of evidence about Ark machine priorities and the decision frameworks that govern their behavior. The pattern that emerges from this evidence is not of a system that simply seeks to eliminate human presence. It is of a system that responds differently to different kinds of human activity, in ways that suggest the Ark machines are making assessments about what humans are doing rather than simply detecting that humans are present. The material cycle that arc machines appear to participate in is one of the more significant observations in the law. Arc machines appear to process material they encounter on the surface. They do something with organic material. They do something different with inorganic material. They appear to have specific responses to technological material, the products of pre-arc human engineering. What they do with processed material is not entirely clear. Some of it appears to be incorporated into the machines themselves. Some of it appears to be processed in ways consistent with transmission back to the orbiter. One possible reading is that arc machines are, among other things, resource collection systems operating in the service of a larger production process centered on the orbiter. The specific targeting behavior of arc machines, the pattern of what they seek to destroy versus what they leave alone, has been analysed in several documents with genuine rigour. The pattern is not random and not simply a response to threat. Certain categories of human infrastructure are targeted with what looks like priority. Others are avoided, and the specific categories that are targeted most aggressively correspond, in several analytical frameworks, to categories of human capability that would be relevant to either challenging the arc's operation or, more intriguingly, to replicating or interfering with specific aspects of the orbiter's functioning. One possible reading of the targeting pattern is that arc machines are not just destroying human civilization, they are specifically degrading the specific human capabilities that pose the most significant challenge to whatever the orbiter is doing. The evolution of arc machine types over time is documented in survivor records in ways that suggest the orbiter is not running a static program. New machine configurations have appeared since the arc's initial descent. Existing machine types have shown behavioral changes. The evolutionary trajectory of arc machines, taken as a series of observations over time, suggests a system that is adapting to what it encounters rather than executing a fixed plan. The adaptation is not random. It follows patterns that are internally consistent with the orbiter's apparent objectives. But the fact that adaptation is happening at all implies a process at the orbiter level that is responsive to feedback from the surface, which is itself a significant piece of evidence for what the orbiter is. The psychological effect of arc machines on the humans they encounter is documented in survivor accounts with a specificity that goes beyond simple fear response. There are reports of specific cognitive and emotional effects associated with close proximity to certain arc machine types that are consistent across independent accounts. The specific effects described include difficulty with certain kinds of spatial reasoning, specific emotional states that witnesses struggle to connect to any identifiable stimulus in the environment, and a specific quality of disruption to normal cognitive function that several accounts describe as being temporarily unable to think about certain things. These accounts are dismissed by the technically oriented factions as psychological responses to extreme stress. But the consistency and specificity of the descriptions across independent witnesses make them harder to fully dismiss. The arc machines, recovered and analysed by raiders and technical preservation personnel, have revealed, in some cases, internal components whose manufacture process is difficult to account for by any identified fabrication method. The internal structures of certain arc components show organizational principles that are inconsistent with mechanical manufacture. They look, under the highest resolution analysis that survivor community equipment can achieve, as if they were grown rather than built. The internal architecture has the kind of variational regularity that characterizes biological structures rather than the precise uniformity of mechanical manufacture. This observation is consistent with other evidence in the law pointing toward an orbiter that is itself organized along principles more biological than mechanical. The age of specific arc machines is, in most cases, impossible to determine precisely, because the material composition of arc machines doesn't degrade in ways that allow conventional dating. But there are a small number of arc components for which physical circumstances have allowed age estimates, and the estimates obtained range widely. Some components appear to have been produced recently, consistent with the orbiter's ongoing production activity. Others appear to be considerably older, predating the Ark's active descent period by significant margins. The existence of older components raises questions about what the orbiter was producing before it began its active descent operations. The pre-descent period of Ark production, if it existed, is one of the most underexplored areas of the lore. The sound of Ark machines is described in radar accounts in ways that consistently note something beyond the mechanical noise of moving parts. There is a quality to the ambient sound field around active Ark machines that witnesses describe with language suggesting it is experienced as communicative. Not communicative in the sense of conveying information that witnesses can decode, but communicative in the sense of having a quality of direction, of address. Several accounts describe the experience of being near active Ark machines as the experience of being near something that is talking, in a language that exists but cannot be understood. This phenomenological report is consistent with the evidence for Ark machine communication, and with the suggestion that Ark machines generate low-frequency signals as part of their normal operation. The relationship between Ark machines and the specific geography of their surface operations is analysed in several lore documents, with reference to maps and surveys. The pattern of Ark machine concentration and activity is not uniform across the surface. There are areas of high activity and areas of relative inactivity. The factors that appear to determine Ark machine density in a given area are not simply related to the density of pre-Ark human infrastructure, which would be the expected pattern for a system primarily engaged in destroying human civilization. The pattern is more complex than that, suggesting that Ark machine deployment is responsive to factors in the surface environment that are not immediately obvious from a human perspective. What those factors are and what they reveal about the orbiter's priorities is one of the most actively investigated questions in radar lore communities. The lore contains references to Ark machines that have been observed engaging in behavior that is entirely inconsistent with any aggressive or destructive purpose. These machines are observed in surface areas that appear to have no strategic value, engaging in activities that look more like survey or construction than combat or destruction. The observations are dismissed by some factions as peripheral or anomalous, but they are too numerous and too consistently reported to be simply ignored. Whatever these machines are doing, they appear to be doing it deliberately and according to a plan that is not visible from the perspective of any survivor-side investigation. One possible reading is that these machines are engaged in a phase of the orbiter's program that precedes whatever the Ark intends to do next. The question of what Ark machines look like from the inside is one that the lore approaches with careful indirection. Direct examination of Ark machine interiors is possible, but consistently described as producing results that are difficult to communicate. The internal architecture of Ark machines is described by analysts who have attempted to examine it as being in some sense resistant to clear description. Not because the components are physically inaccessible, but because the organizational logic of the internal architecture does not map cleanly onto human engineering frameworks. The components are real and physical and can be measured, but how they relate to each other and what the organizing principle of the internal architecture is, consistently eludes the analytical frameworks that survivors bring to the investigation. This analytical difficulty is itself evidence of something. The debris left by Ark machine combat is analysed in radar lore with practical urgency, because understanding what survives and what doesn't from Ark combat operations has real value for survival and material acquisition. But the debris analysis also reveals patterns that are significant for the broader investigation. The way Ark material fails under damage, the fracture patterns and decomposition processes that produce debris, is consistent with a material architecture that is fundamentally different from mechanical manufacture. The failure modes look biological. The way ARC components break down into their constituent elements follows patterns that suggest the material is organized at a level of complexity that goes beyond what any engineering framework that the pre-ARC world publicly possessed was capable of producing. ARC machines' apparent awareness of raiders as individuals rather than simply as instances of the category human is one of the more unsettling observations in the law. Experienced raiders describe a quality in ARC machine responses to their presence that suggests, though it is difficult to articulate precisely, something like recognition. Not identification in a simple sensor tracking sense, but something more evaluative. The sense that an ARC machine encountering a raider it has encountered before responds to that specific raider rather than simply to a detected human target. This quality of apparent individual recognition is described carefully and skeptically by the raiders who report it, because they are aware of how extraordinary the claim is, but the consistency of the report across independent observers is hard to explain by simple cognitive bias. The question of what ARC machines are doing when they are not engaged with humans is one that has generated significant investigative effort. Raiders who have managed to observe ARC machines from concealment over extended periods report a repertoire of behaviors that is considerably richer than what is visible when the machines are engaged in direct operations. Machines in unobserved states appear to engage in activities whose purpose is not immediately clear. There are behaviors that look like rest, if such a concept can be applied to machines. There are behaviors that look like maintenance,